There is a drawer in a museum that holds a piece of fired clay approximately the size of a human hand. The clay is buff brown, dark at the edges of the wedge-shaped impressions pressed into its surface 4,000 years ago by a scribe whose name has not survived. The impressions are cuneiform, the writing system of ancient Mesopotamia, the oldest sustained writing tradition in human history, a system developed not for literature or religion, but for the management of grain, land, labor, and institutional obligation in the world's first cities. The scribe who pressed these particular signs into this particular piece of clay was doing what Sumerian scribes did, documenting something real, in the administrative language of the world's most methodical record-keeping tradition, for the institutional purpose of ensuring that the information would be available when it was needed. The information is still there. The clay held it. The drawer holds the clay. The signs are readable. What they say is the subject of this series. This is not a series about what ancient people believed. There are excellent series about Sumerian cosmology, about the myths of Enlil and Enki and Inanna, about the great literary compositions that the Sumerian scribal tradition produced alongside its administrative records. Those series address what ancient people believed, what stories they told about the divine world, what cosmological framework organized their understanding of existence. This series does not address those questions, except where the answers to them help clarify something about what the sixth fragment says. This series is about what ancient people documented. It is about the difference between a document that tells you what someone believed and a document that tells you where something is. It is about the grammatical feature of one specific Sumerian clay tablet that changes which of those two categories the document belongs to. And it is about what follows from reading that document in the correct category rather than the incorrect one. The correct category is the one the scribe chose. The scribe chose the present continuous grammatical construction. That construction, in the Sumerian administrative tradition, means one specific thing. The document is describing a current state, not a past event. It is active documentation, not historical record. The scribe was not commemorating something that had happened. The scribe was recording where something is. That single grammatical choice, the choice between is and was, is what this series is built on. Not because grammar is the most interesting thing about the sixth fragment, but because getting the grammar right is the prerequisite for everything else. If you read is as was, the document becomes a historical record of a past placement. If you read is as is, the document becomes a retrieval record for a current location. Everything that follows from the document, what it means, what it implies, what it would mean to take it seriously, depends on which reading you apply. This episode is about the grammar, not as an academic exercise, as the foundation for 10 hours of investigation into what the sixth fragment says, where the machine it describes is, and what kind of evidence would be needed to act on what the clay has preserved. Begin with the Sumerian scribal tradition itself, because the tradition is the context that makes the grammatical argument work. The Sumerian scribal schools, called eduba in the surviving literature, a word that means house of tablets, were among the most sophisticated educational institutions of the ancient world. The training they provided was long, demanding, and highly specific. Students spent years learning not just the mechanics of pressing cuneiform signs into clay, but the full range of textual conventions that the scribal profession required. Different document types had different structures, different vocabularies, different formulaic openings and closings, different organizational patterns. A scribe who produced a temple hymn in the format of an administrative land record, or a legal document in the format of a literary composition, was not displaying creativity. They were making an error, the professional equivalent of a modern accountant producing a balance sheet in the format of a legal brief. The forms were distinct. The scribes knew the forms. Competent scribes applied the correct form to the correct content. This is not a romantic idealization of the Sumerian scribal tradition. The evidence for it is direct. The surviving scribal school exercises, the tablets that students produced as practice pieces, working through the curriculum of their training, show exactly this kind of formal instruction. Students copied model documents. They learned the standard opening formulas of each document type. They practiced the specific sign groups that appeared in administrative records but not in literary texts. the specific constructions that appeared in legal documents but not in hymns, the specific vocabulary of temple ritual that differed from the vocabulary of commercial exchange. The grammatical forms were part of this training. Sumerian grammar distinguished between completed action and ongoing action, between historical description and current state description, between a record of what happened and a record of what is. These distinctions were not incidental. They were functional. They determined how a document was read and what kind of information it was understood to contain. A document recording a grain delivery used the completed action form because the delivery was complete, the grain arrived, the record was made, the event was documented. A document recording the current inventory level of a granary used the present continuous form because the inventory level was current. This is what is there now, at the time of writing, as of this administrative moment. The sixth fragment uses the present continuous form to describe the location of the machine. This is a deliberate grammatical choice. It reflects the Sumerian scribal training in which the form was associated with current state documentation. The scribe chose this form because the content was current. The machine is located here, now, at the time this document is being written. The document is a current state record, not a historical record of a past placement. This seems like a small point. It is not a small point. Consider what happens when you change the grammatical reading. When the present continuous is rendered in past tense, as it typically is in modern scholarly translations, following the convention of treating ancient documents as historical records, the document says, "The machine was placed here." That reading situates the document in the past. It describes a completed event, a placement that occurred at some historical moment. The document becomes an interesting ancient text that tells you where something was put a long time ago. It joins the large category of ancient records that describe past events and conditions. When the present continuous is read correctly, as a present continuous describing a current state, the document says, "The machine is located here." That reading situates the document in an administrative present. It describes an ongoing condition, the machine's location as of the time of writing. The document becomes an active record that tells you where something currently is. It belongs to the specific category of Sumerian administrative documents designed to preserve current state information for future retrieval. The category distinction is not a subtle one. Administrative archives maintained records of different kinds for different purposes. Historical records documented the past. They told you what had happened, when, and who was involved. Current state records documented the present. They told you what was currently the case, what the current status of an ongoing situation was, what information you would need if you needed to act on that situation in the future. The archive preserved both kinds, because both kinds served institutional purposes. Historical records established precedent and continuity. Current state records enabled operational decisions. The sixth fragment is a current state record. Its content, the location of one of the 6 machines, specified with 3 triangulating reference systems, is exactly the kind of content that current state records contain. Its grammatical form, the present continuous, is exactly the form that current state records use. Its structure, no narrative context, no historical framing, just the location information itself, is exactly the structure of a retrieval document rather than a historical account. Everything about the 6th fragment, read correctly, identifies it as a current state record designed to preserve location information for future retrieval that has not occurred. The document is in a museum. The location it describes, in the present continuous tense, is in the ground. The retrieval for which the document was designed has not happened. The clay has preserved the location information for 4,000 years past its intended use date, waiting for a reader who would read it as it was written, as a current state record, in the present continuous tense, describing where something is. Now, why does the past tense translation convention exist, and why does it matter that it exists? The convention arose for a completely reasonable reason. Ancient texts are ancient. When a modern scholar reads a Sumerian document, the events and conditions it describes are not current. They occurred thousands of years ago. Translating a Sumerian present continuous as an English present tense can be misleading in contexts where the modern reader might confuse the ancient administrative present the present as of the moment the scribe wrote, with the literal present of today. To avoid this confusion, translators default to past tense. The grain was delivered, the land belonged to the god's household, the object was placed at this location. This convention is reasonable and usually harmless. For most Sumerian administrative documents, it introduces no distortion. When a scribe recorded that 300 kor of barley were delivered to a temple storehouse, the delivery is historical. Translating the Sumerian form as past tense is accurate. The delivery happened in the past, and the record documents that past event. The convention fits. The convention stops fitting when it is applied to documents whose content is not a past event, but an ongoing condition, when the scribe was not recording that something happened, but documenting that something is currently the case. For these documents, the past tense convention converts a current state record into a historical record. It changes the category of the document, and changing the category changes what the document is understood to mean and what it is understood to be able to tell you. The sixth fragment is a document of exactly this kind. Its content is not a past event, not a placement that occurred, not a transfer that happened, not an action that was taken. Its content is an ongoing condition, a location that is current, a storage state that persists, a piece of information that is valid as of the time of writing and expected to remain valid. The scribe chose the present continuous because the content was ongoing. The past tense translation convention converts this ongoing condition into a historical event. The conversion is the error. It is a small error in form and a large error in implication. In form, it changes a verb tense. In implication, it changes what kind of document the sixth fragment is and what kind of information it contains. A historical record of a past placement tells you where something was at some point in the past. A current state record of an ongoing location tells you where something is, or was, at a specific documented moment, with the administrative logic of retrieval documentation, implying that the condition was expected to persist. The difference between those two readings is the difference between a document that closes a question and a document that opens one. A historical record of a past placement closes the question of where the machine is by situating the placement in an irretrievable past. You cannot retrieve what was placed in the past. You can only note that it was placed. A current state record of an ongoing location opens the question of where the machine is by establishing that the location was current, documented, and intended to remain accessible. The location was recorded for retrieval. The retrieval document still exists. The question of whether the location record is still accurate, whether the machine is still where the sixth fragment says it is a live question, not a closed one. This series treats that question as live, not because the answer is certain. It is not certain. 4,000 years have passed since the sixth fragment was written. Things change. The custodial arrangement that governed the machine's management included a return clause. The prior authority that owned the machine could require its return or relocation at any point. If that return was requested and complied with, the machine is no longer where the sixth fragment says it is. The absence of a return record in the surviving archive does not prove the return did not occur. The archive is fragmentary. Many documents have been lost. But the absence of a return record, combined with the present continuous tense of the location record, combined with the administrative logic of Sumerian custodial documentation, all point in the same direction. As of the most recent administrative statement about the machine's location, the machine was there. No subsequent document changes this. The sixth fragment is the last word the surviving archive has on the subject. That last word is in the present continuous tense. It says the machine is there, not was, is. The three reference systems of the sixth fragment deserve extended treatment because they are the content of the retrieval document, the actual location information that the scribe preserved. Reference System 1. Regional territory. The Sumerian approach to geographic description in administrative texts moved from broad to specific, a narrowing sequence of references that together triangulated a location more precisely than any single reference could. The broadest reference established the region, which part of the known world, which geographic territory, which zone of the Sumerian understanding of the Earth's organization. The sixth fragment's regional descriptor identifies the territory associated with what Sumerian geographic vocabulary called the Great River System. This is a specific and recognizable descriptor in the Sumerian geographic tradition. The Great River System referred to the network of waterways, primary rivers, secondary channels, irrigation canals, tributaries, that defined the geographic character of the Mesopotamian river plain. The territory associated with this system was the alluvial plain between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the lowland zone of southern Mesopotamia, where the rivers deposited their sediment load and where the accumulated deposits of millennia had built up the flat, fertile, irrigable plain that Sumerian civilization inhabited. This territory is not vague. It excludes the entire upland zone of Mesopotamia, the Zagros foothills to the east, the Taurus highlands to the north, the Syrian steppe to the west. It excludes Egypt, the Levant, Anatolia, the Iranian plateau, the Indus Valley, and every other region of the ancient world. It identifies a specific zone of southern Iraq, defined by the presence of the Great River System and the alluvial deposits it produced. The territory spans hundreds of kilometers and contains dozens of ancient city sites. It is not a precise location, but it is a defined territory, and the definition is meaningful. Modern knowledge of this territory is extensive. The geology of the alluvial plain of southern Mesopotamia has been studied in detail. The patterns of river channel migration, sediment deposition, and landscape change over the past several thousand years are understood from both geological fieldwork and satellite remote sensing. The positions of ancient city sites within this territory are documented from more than a century and a half of archaeological investigation. The territory that the sixth fragment's regional descriptor identifies is the most extensively studied ancient landscape in the world. Reference System 2, Depth Specification. The second reference system in the sixth fragment specifies how deep below the surface the machine was placed. The Sumerian measurement unit used for this specification is one that appears in other administrative and architectural contexts, including, critically, in records of major temple foundation depths. This connection is significant because it provides a calibration reference. The depths of major Sumerian temple foundations are known from archaeological evidence. Excavations of major Sumerian temple sites have exposed foundation features, measured their depths from original ancient surface levels, and produced records that allow the ancient measurement unit to be correlated with physical dimensions. A foundation depth recorded in this unit can be converted to a metric equivalent with reasonable confidence. The depth specified in the sixth fragment corresponds, in this calibration, to something in the range of the deepest intentional placements in Sumerian construction practice, the depths of major architectural foundations, not shallow surface burials. This is significant for two reasons. First, it establishes that the placement was deliberate and substantial, not a casual burial, but an intentional placement at a depth associated with major permanent installation. Second, it establishes that the effective current depth from the modern surface is greater than the recorded depth from the ancient surface, because 4,000 years of alluvial sediment accumulation has added additional meters above the ancient surface level. The alluvial sediment accumulation rates of southern Mesopotamia are known from geological study. They are not uniform. Different areas have experienced different rates depending on proximity to river channels, flood patterns, and other factors. But average accumulation rates for the region provide a reasonable estimate of how much the surface has risen since the Sumerian period. Adding this estimated accumulation to the recorded depth from the ancient surface gives an estimated current depth from the modern surface. The estimated current depth is substantial. The machine described in the sixth fragment is not just below the surface by a few centimeters, it is at a depth that requires organized, deliberate excavation to reach. The depth calibration establishes that the placement was in the deep alluvial layers below the zone of ordinary archaeological disturbance from historical and modern activity. Reference System 3, the landmark. The third reference system is the one that both most precisely specifies the location and most complicates the retrieval. A landmark reference allows the person with the retrieval document to start from a known surface feature and calculate the underground location relative to it. The landmark described in the sixth fragment is identified with vocabulary that in other Sumerian administrative texts refers to major institutional structures, not private houses or minor facilities, but the kind of large, prominent, unmistakable structures that anchored the landscape of a Sumerian city. The vocabulary strongly suggests a major temple complex. The connection between the machine's management and the Sumerian temple administrative system is established in the other fragments. The me-level operator designation, the custodial arrangement, the archive in which all 6 fragments were preserved, all point toward the temple system as the institutional context of the machine's management. A landmark associated with a major temple complex near the machine's storage location is consistent with all of this context. The complication is that the landmark is underground. 4,000 years of sediment accumulation have buried the ancient city, whose temple complex served as the location reference. The landmark is now a subsurface feature, not a surface one. It cannot be seen from the surface. It cannot be directly identified without excavation. But it is not unknowable. The positions of major temple complexes at the principal Sumerian city sites are documented from archaeological excavation. The locations of the major temples at Uruk, Nippur, Eridu, Lagash, and other principal sites have been mapped with considerable precision from the evidence of more than a century of systematic excavation. If the sixth fragment's landmark can be identified with one of these documented temple complexes, if the vocabulary used to describe it matches the known characteristics of one of the major excavated temples, then the landmark's subsurface position is known, and the machine's location relative to that landmark can in principle be calculated. The identification has not been made. This is the central challenge of taking the sixth fragment seriously as a retrieval document. The landmark description uses terms that could apply to multiple major temple complexes across multiple city sites. The identification requires additional evidence, either from companion documents that may exist in museum collections or in unexcavated ground, or from a more systematic application of the existing landmark vocabulary to the known archaeological record of Sumerian temple sites. The scholarly context for the present continuous reading requires honest engagement with the alternative. The mainstream scholarly treatment of the sixth fragment, and of the 5 other fragments that constitute the machine archive, reads them as mythological or cosmological texts. In this reading, the machines are not real physical objects but symbolic representations of divine powers, cosmic functions, or religious concepts. The administrative vocabulary is understood as a register of elevated religious language rather than as literal institutional documentation. The present continuous is rendered as past tense because the document is understood to describe the divine world, and the divine world is, in this framework, a realm of symbolic truth rather than literal current fact. This reading has a long and distinguished scholarly tradition behind it. The study of Sumerian religion and cosmology has produced profound insights into how the Sumerians understood the world, how they conceptualized the relationship between divine and human realms, how their religious traditions influenced and were influenced by their neighbors over millennia. The scholars who work in this tradition are not making naive errors. They are applying a well-developed interpretive framework to a complex body of evidence. The argument of this series is not that this framework is wrong in general. For the vast majority of Sumerian religious and cosmological texts, the symbolic religious reading is the correct one. Temple hymns are religious documents. Mythological narratives are religious documents. Cosmological creation accounts are religious documents. The framework is appropriate to them. The argument is that the framework is incorrect for the 6 machine fragments specifically, and that the misapplication of the framework to these specific documents is the reason the retrieval document reading has not been pursued. The misapplication rests on a categorical assumption that documents produced within the Sumerian divine administrative system are necessarily mythological. The Sumerian divine administrative system is, in this assumption, a religious system, and documents produced within it are religious documents, and religious documents are interpreted symbolically rather than literally. The problem with this assumption is that the Sumerian divine administrative system was not only a religious system, it was also a practical management system for real things. The same institutional framework that managed the relationships between gods and humans also managed land, grain, labor, temple property, and commercial exchange. The god's household was a real institutional entity that held real property managed by real human administrators. Documents produced within this institutional context described real things, real land allocations, real grain distributions, real labor obligations, in the same vocabulary that described the divine administrative structure of the cosmos. When a Sumerian document uses divine administrative vocabulary to describe real land and real grain, the divine administrative vocabulary does not make the land and grain mythological. The land is real. The grain is real. The vocabulary is the administrative register of the institutional context in which the land and grain were managed. The vocabulary and the content are not the same thing. The same logic applies to the 6 machine fragments. The divine administrative vocabulary in which they are written is the vocabulary of the institutional context in which the machines were managed. That vocabulary does not make the machines mythological. The vocabulary is the register. The machines are the content. If the machines were real physical objects managed within the divine administrative system, which is exactly what the administrative character of the document suggests, then the divine administrative vocabulary is simply the correct register for documenting them, just as it is the correct register for documenting the land and grain that the same system managed. This is not a trivial reframing. It is the difference between reading the 6 fragments as evidence of what the Sumerians believed about the cosmos and reading them as documentation of what the Sumerians managed in the physical world. The first reading is interpretive. The second reading is operational. The first reading asks, what symbolic meaning do these documents convey? The second reading asks, what physical facts do these documents record? The 6th fragment, read as operational documentation in the present continuous tense, records a physical fact, the location of a machine in underground storage. The location is specified with 3 triangulating reference systems. The document is structured as a retrieval record. The grammar says the condition is current. 4,000 years of past tense translation have obscured this. This series is an attempt to restore the correct reading, to read the 6th fragment as it was written, in the tense the scribe chose, for the purpose the document was designed to serve. The present continuous tense in the 6th fragment is not an isolated feature. It is consistent with everything else about the document's form. Retrieval documents in the Sumerian administrative tradition share a cluster of formal features that distinguish them from historical records. The present continuous or present state grammatical construction, the absence of narrative context, the triangulating reference structure that specifies location from multiple approaches, and the functional storage condition description. The 6th fragment has all 4 of these features. It uses the present continuous. It has no narrative context, no account of when the machine was placed, who placed it, what circumstances led to the placement. It specifies the location with 3 triangulating reference systems: regional territory, depth, landmark. And it describes the storage condition in functional terms. The machine is stored in a condition consistent with continued functionality, not in a condition of abandonment or deterioration. 4 formal features, all pointing to the same document type, a retrieval record for an object in ongoing storage. The grammar is the most important of these features because it most directly establishes the document's relationship to time, whether the document is about the past or about the present. But the grammar does not stand alone. It is corroborated by the structure, the content organization, and the storage condition description. The entire form of the document says retrieval record. The grammar says present condition. The content says location. Together, this is a retrieval document describing the current location of an object in storage. The grammar, the structure, and the content all agree. The object is in the ground. The document is in a museum. The grammar has been misread for the entire period since the document was first translated. This series is the attempt to read it correctly and to follow what the correct reading implies about where something has been waiting for 4,000 years in the alluvial ground of southern Mesopotamia. What follows in the remaining 9 episodes is the full investigation. Episode 2 examines the myth versus management distinction, the foundational question of how to categorize the machine archive within the broader Sumerian textual tradition, and why the administrative category is correct. Episode 3 examines the me tradition, and what it means for a machine's operators to hold a me-level functional designation. Episode 4 examines the custodial transfer record and the entity prior to the organized world from whom one of the machines was received. Episode 5 examines the safety record, the physical consequence documentation for unauthorized activation, and what it implies about the machines as real physical systems. Episode 6 examines the altered tablet, the document from which the functional description of one machine was surgically removed after firing, and what the alteration reveals about the information security architecture of the archive. Episode 7 examines the geology of the alluvial plain and the depth calculation that places the machine's current location below a specific level of sediment. Episode 8 examines the landmark identification challenge, the question of which major Sumerian temple complex corresponds to the 6th fragment's landmark description. Episode 9 examines the subsurface investigation technologies that would be applicable to a search at the estimated location. Episode 10 synthesizes the full investigation and presents the case for taking the 6th fragment's retrieval document character seriously as a basis for archaeological inquiry. 10 episodes. 1 question. Where is the machine? The grammar says it is there. The ground holds whatever the grammar describes. Now, back to the tablets. There is a question that has to be settled before any other question in this series can be properly addressed. It is not a dramatic question. It does not have a sensational answer, but it is the foundational question on which everything else depends, and getting it wrong makes everything else wrong with it. The question is this: what kind of documents are the 6 machine fragments? That sounds like an academic question. It is not only an academic question. Document type determines how a document is read, what it is understood to mean, what kind of information it is understood to contain, and what questions it is understood to be able to answer. A document type is not a label applied after the fact by scholars who have already decided what the document means. It is a formal category that the document itself belongs to by virtue of its vocabulary, structure, grammatical conventions, and content organization. Getting the document type right is the prerequisite for getting the content right. The mainstream scholarly position on the 6 machine fragments categorizes them as mythological or cosmological texts. The machines are understood as symbols of divine powers or cosmic functions, metaphorical expressions of the Sumerian cosmological worldview, rather than descriptions of real physical objects. The administrative vocabulary in which the fragments are written is understood as a register of elevated religious language. The locations, the operator designations, the safety records, the custodial transfer, all of these are understood as elements of a symbolic system that describes the divine world rather than elements of an institutional system that documents the management of real things. The argument of this series is that this categorization is incorrect, and that the correct categorization is administrative documentation. The 6 fragments are management documents. They describe what the Sumerians did with the machines, not what the Sumerians believed about them. The distinction between these 2 kinds of documents is real, consequential, and determinable from the documents themselves. Let us begin with how the Sumerian scribal tradition actually organized its textual production, because the organization of that tradition is what makes the document type question answerable rather than merely interpretive. The Sumerian scribal tradition produced texts of many kinds: temple hymns, creation narratives, royal inscriptions, wisdom literature, lament compositions, legal records, commercial contracts, land allocations, labor management records, grain distribution accounts, astronomical observations, medical prescriptions, mathematical tables, letter archives, administrative correspondence, culinary recipes, school exercises. Each of these text types had its own formal conventions, its own standard vocabulary, its own structural organization, its own grammatical patterns, its own characteristic content. A scribe trained in the scribal tradition knew these conventions and applied them with professional precision. The formal conventions were not decorative, they were functional. They allowed a reader, another trained scribe or a temple administrator who could read, to identify the type of document immediately from its opening lines, its vocabulary, and its structural organization. You did not need to read an entire document to know whether you were reading a grain delivery record or a temple hymn. The form told you, the vocabulary told you, the structure told you. You knew what kind of information the document contained and how to interpret it before you had read past the first few lines. This formal convention system is what allows the document type question to be answered for the 6 machine fragments. The fragments can be examined for their vocabulary, their structure, and their grammatical patterns, and these formal features can be compared to the known conventions of different Sumerian text types. The comparison produces a document type identification that does not rest on subjective interpretation. It rests on the formal features of the documents themselves, compared against the documented conventions of the scribal tradition. When that comparison is made, the 6 machine fragments do not match the formal conventions of Sumerian mythological or cosmological texts. They match the formal conventions of Sumerian administrative records. Consider the mythological text conventions first, because understanding what the fragments are not is as important as understanding what they are. Sumerian mythological texts, the compositions that narrate divine events, describe the relationships between gods, and account for the founding acts of the organized world, have recognizable formal features. They open with invocations or scene-setting passages that establish the divine context. They use a narrative grammatical mode, a past tense or aorist form that describes events as they unfolded. They employ the elevated, ornate vocabulary associated with divine speech and divine action, a register that is distinct from the plain functional vocabulary of administrative texts. They are structured as sequences of events, each event following causally from the previous one, with the narrative arc moving from an initial situation through complications to a resolution. The 6 machine fragments do not have any of these features. They do not open with invocations or scene setting. They do not use a narrative grammatical mode. The 6th fragment, as established in the previous episode, uses the present continuous, a non-narrative, current state construction. The 3rd fragment, the safety record, uses the conditional consequential structure of procedural documentation. If this condition obtains, then these effects follow. The 5th fragment, the custodial transfer record, uses the standard vocabulary and formulaic structure of legal transfer documentation. The 4th fragment, the operator designation, uses the categorical vocabulary of the me tradition in an administrative, not a narrative, register. None of these is a feature of mythological composition. All of them are features of administrative documentation. Now consider the administrative record conventions, because understanding what the fragments match is the positive case. Sumerian administrative records, the documents that manage the institutional operations of temples, cities, and the divine household, have their own recognizable formal features. They open with statements of category. This is a record of X for the purpose of Y. They use the functional vocabulary of institutional management, vocabulary for storage conditions, operator designations, transfer arrangements, location specifications, consequence assessments. They employ the grammatical constructions appropriate to their content, the completed action form for records of past events, the present continuous form for records of current states, the conditional form for procedural documentation. They are structured according to the content they contain. A location record has a location, a transfer record has parties, an object, and terms. A consequence record has a triggering condition and a list of effects. The 6 machine fragments have all of these features. They use functional administrative vocabulary, not the elevated vocabulary of divine speech, but the plain vocabulary of institutional management. They employ the grammatically appropriate constructions for their content, the present continuous in the 6th fragment, the conditional consequential in the 3rd, the transfer documentation formulae in the 5th. They are structured as their content requires. The 6th fragment has a location, the 5th has parties and terms, the 3rd has a triggering condition and effects. The formal evidence is unambiguous. The 6 machine fragments are administrative records. They were produced in the administrative genre. They follow the conventions of the administrative genre. They should be read as administrative records. But the mythological reading persists, and it is worth understanding exactly why it persists, because understanding the source of the error is part of understanding why it is an error. The mythological reading persists because of the content's apparent subject matter. The machines are described as having cosmological functions. One is at the boundary between the organized earth and the underworld, another is at the upper boundary of the organized sky. The operators are designated at the level of the me, which is a fundamentally cosmological concept. Content of this kind, content that involves cosmological positions and cosmic-level functions, is typically associated with mythological texts in the Sumerian tradition. When the machines appear to be doing cosmological things, the categorical instinct is to read the documents that describe them as cosmological texts. This is the category error. The error is in assuming that cosmological content implies mythological genre. It does not. The Sumerian temple administrative system managed things that were understood in cosmological terms. The land belonged to the god because the god held the cosmological authority over that land. The grain was managed by the temple because the temple was the god's household, and the god's household managed the resources of the god's cosmological domain. The fact that these things were understood in cosmological terms did not make the documents that managed them mythological. The land allocation was still a real land allocation. The grain distribution was still a real grain distribution. The document that recorded the land allocation was still an administrative document, regardless of the cosmological framework within which the allocation was understood. The same principle applies to the machines. If the machines performed functions that the Sumerians understood in cosmological terms, maintaining the boundary between organized earth and underworld, for example, the documents that managed the machines were still administrative documents. The cosmological understanding of the machine's functions is the framework within which the machines were managed. It is not the document type. This distinction between the content's cosmological character and the document's administrative genre is the foundation of the management reading. The machines may have had cosmological functions in the Sumerian understanding. That does not make the document's administrative documents any less administrative. It makes them administrative documents about objects with cosmological functions. The difference matters enormously for how the documents are read. A mythological text about an object with cosmological functions is read symbolically. The object is a symbol. Its functions are metaphors for cosmic truths. Its location is a symbolic location. Its operators are divine characters in a cosmic drama. Its safety record, if it has one, is a symbolic warning about the consequences of transgression against divine order. An administrative document about an object with cosmological functions is read literally, or as close to literally as the administrative conventions allow. The object is a real object. Its functions are real functions, understood and described in cosmological terms by the people who managed it. Its location is a real location, specified with the precision that administrative location records require. Its operators are designated functionaries in a real institutional hierarchy. Its safety record is a real consequence documentation for real physical effects. The first reading closes the question of what the machines are and where they are. They are symbols, and symbols are not in locations that can be investigated. The second reading opens the question. The machines are real objects, and real objects are in locations that can be investigated. Now examine each of the 6 fragments in turn, briefly, through the lens of the administrative document argument, to show how each one is consistent with the administrative reading and inconsistent with the mythological reading. The first fragment describes a machine in a sealed condition at a specific cosmological geographic position, with a retrieval record preserved in the archive. The administrative features, sealed status, a recognized administrative condition in the Sumerian tradition, distinct from abandoned or completed; retrieval record, a document type whose purpose is to preserve location information for future access; and the combination of the two, which means someone understood the sealed condition as temporary and the retrieval information as needed. Mythological texts do not describe sealed conditions in administrative terms. They do not maintain retrieval records for sealed divine objects. The first fragment's treatment of its object is institutional, not symbolic. The second fragment describes a machine whose functional description was surgically removed from the archival record after the tablet was fired, while the location and physical description were preserved. The administrative features: the alteration is an institutional act, accessing a fired and archived document, removing specific content with tools, and returning the document to the archive in an altered state, that required institutional authorization and institutional access. Mythological texts are not subject to content redaction for information security purposes. The alteration of the second machine's tablet is not a mythological gesture, it is an institutional one. Someone with the authority to modify archive documents decided that the functional description of the second machine should not remain in the accessible archive. That is, an information management decision, not a theological one. The third fragment is a consequence record for unauthorized activation of one of the machines. The administrative features: the sequential, locally bounded, physically specific character of the consequences, radius specification, sequential environmental effects in 3 categories, staged biological response, is the formal structure of procedural consequence documentation. Mythological consequence language does not specify radii. It does not enumerate environmental categories sequentially. It does not describe staged biological responses in which perception changes before physical condition changes. The third fragment's consequence structure is the structure of physical process documentation, not divine punishment narrative. The fourth fragment connects the machine operators to the me tradition at the level of foundational importance corresponding to kingship and the scribal arts. The administrative features: the me-level designation is an institutional assignment, not a divine honor. The me are the operational conditions of organized existence, institutional conditions that must be continuously maintained by designated functionaries. The machine operator's me-level designation means they hold a functional role in the institutional maintenance of the organized world, at the same level of institutional importance as the political function of kingship. Mythological texts celebrate divine figures and their cosmic achievements. Administrative records designate functional categories and their institutional responsibilities. The fourth fragment is a functional designation, not a divine celebration. The fifth fragment is a custodial transfer record. The administrative features: the structure of the document, parties, object, terms, maintenance conditions, return clause, is the structure of a legal transfer record in the Sumerian institutional tradition. The return clause is particularly significant. It acknowledges that the machine remains the property of the originating party and can be required back at any time. Return clauses appear in real legal documents for real objects. They do not appear in mythological narratives as elements of cosmic storytelling. A return clause is a legal instrument. Legal instruments are administrative documents. The sixth fragment is a current location record in the present continuous tense. The administrative features established in Episode 1 and foundational to everything that follows. Taken together, the 6 fragments form an archive that is internally consistent as administrative documentation. Each fragment, examined individually, displays the formal features of administrative records. Taken together, they form a coherent administrative file on a system of 6 objects, exactly the kind of institutional file that a Sumerian temple administration would maintain for objects of significant importance under active management. The mythological reading cannot account for this coherence. A collection of mythological texts about cosmic objects would not have the administrative coherence of the machine archive. It would not combine sealed status records with retrieval documentation, functional consequence records with information security alterations, custodial transfer records with current location documentation. Mythological texts do not form this kind of institutional file. Administrative records do. The management reading accounts for the coherence perfectly. The 6 fragments are the institutional file for a system of 6 objects managed within the Sumerian divine administrative system. The file contains the kinds of documents that a real institutional file for real objects under real management would contain: status records, safety documentation, operator designations, transfer records, location records. The file is coherent because real institutional files are coherent. The different documents in the file address different aspects of the institutional management of the same system. This coherence is the strongest single argument for the management reading. One unusual document in an otherwise mythological collection could be explained as an anomaly. A coherent institutional file, composed entirely of documents with administrative formal features, cannot be explained as a collection of anomalies. The coherence requires an explanation, and the only explanation that accounts for it fully is that the 6 fragments are what they appear to be: administrative records of a real system under real institutional management. The implications of the management reading for how the 6th fragment is approached are specific and consequential. If the 6 fragments are administrative records, then the 6th fragment's location information is real location information. It was recorded with the precision that administrative location records require. It was preserved in the archive because it was operationally important, because someone needed to be able to find the machine. It is structured as a retrieval document because it was designed to enable retrieval. If the 6th fragment's location information is real location information, then the question of where the machine is can be investigated using the methods appropriate to investigating real locations: geographical analysis, archaeological investigation, subsurface survey technology, archival cross-referencing. The question is not interpreted away as symbolic. It is investigated as a real spatial question about a real object in a real location. This is the program of the remaining 8 episodes. The foundation established in this episode, the administrative document identification, is what makes that program possible. You cannot investigate the location of a symbol. You can investigate the location of a real object that a real administrative document records in the present continuous tense. The machines are real objects. The 6th fragment is a real location record. The location is real. The investigation begins in episode 3, with the question of who was authorized to manage these real objects, the me-level operator designation, and what it tells us about the Sumerian understanding of the machine's importance. Understanding the importance is not separate from understanding the location. The importance of the machines is what motivated the construction of the institutional file in the first place, and it is what motivated the underground placement that the 6th fragment records. Why something was placed where it was placed is often the key to identifying where it was placed. The machines were placed with the care that objects of foundational importance receive. They were managed with the institutional seriousness that me-level functions receive. They were documented with the precision that retrieval-oriented archival practice applies to objects whose future access is anticipated. The documents are in museums. The objects, in the logic of the documents, are in the ground. The management reading says, "Go find them. Now." Back to the tablets. The distinction between myth and management becomes even sharper when you examine specific vocabulary choices the Sumerian scribes made in the machine archive versus the vocabulary they used in unambiguously mythological compositions from the same period. Take the word for sealed in the first fragment. In mythological compositions, when divine objects or places are described as sealed, the vocabulary is the vocabulary of divine prohibition, a barrier of divine authority, an interdiction of sacred power. The sealing is performed by a god. It is maintained by divine will. Breaking it is transgression against the divine order. The first fragment uses a different word, not the word for divine prohibition, but the word for institutional lockdown, the administrative term for closing a storage facility, a granary, a sealed chamber in a temple warehouse. The same word appears in administrative texts that record the sealing of storerooms after inventory has been taken, of archive rooms after tablets have been catalogued, of chambers whose contents must be protected until a specific administrative action authorizes opening. This is the vocabulary of institutional security, not divine prohibition. Sealed as in secured for future access, not sealed as in forbidden. The difference is the difference between a door you cannot open because God forbids it, and a door you cannot open because the administrator in charge has not authorized it. Both conditions produce a closed door. But the vocabulary identifies which condition is in effect, and the vocabulary in the first fragment identifies institutional lockdown, not divine prohibition. The same precision appears in the fifth fragment's custodial transfer documentation. The word for transfer used in the fifth fragment is the standard administrative transfer term. the same word used when temple property changed hands between institutional parties, when land was transferred from one administrative holder to another, when goods were moved from one storage location to another under institutional authorization. This is not the vocabulary of divine gift, of sacred bestowal, of cosmic endowment. It is the vocabulary of institutional property transfer. One party gives, another receives. Both parties are bound by the terms of the transfer. The document records those terms. In mythological compositions that describe the divine origins of human institutions, the vocabulary of cosmic endowment is consistently used. The gods grant things to humans. The granting is not a transfer between institutional parties. It is a cosmic act of bestowal, a divine gift that flows downward from the divine world to the human world. The fifth fragment does not use this vocabulary. It uses the transfer vocabulary of institutional property management. Two parties, terms, a binding legal record, a return clause. This vocabulary precision is not accidental. Sumerian scribes knew both vocabularies. They used both in appropriate contexts. The Ejiba curriculum trained them to use the right vocabulary in the right document type. A trained scribe would not confuse the vocabulary of divine endowment with the vocabulary of institutional transfer. They are used in different document types for a reason. They describe different things. The machine archive consistently uses administrative vocabulary where mythological compositions would use religious vocabulary. The consistency is not random. It reflects the genre, the administrative genre, where institutional vocabulary is correct, and it distinguishes the machine archive from the mythological compositions with which it is too often incorrectly grouped. Now consider the structural argument at a deeper level. The 6 machine fragments, examined as a collection, display what archivists recognize as institutional file coherence. An institutional file on a managed object contains specific document types in specific relationships to each other. The types and their relationships reflect the institutional requirements of managing the object, what you need to know to manage it, what documentation you need to maintain to protect the institution's interests, what records you need to keep so that future administrators can pick up where current administrators left off. For a system of 6 objects managed within the Sumerian divine administrative tradition, the expected file would contain status records for each object, documenting its current condition, operator designation records, identifying who is responsible for its management, safety documentation, protecting the institution from liability for misuse, transfer records, documenting any change in custody or ownership, and location records, enabling future retrieval of stored objects. The 6 machine fragments contain exactly these document types. Status record, the first fragment, documenting sealed status. Operator designation, the 4th fragment, establishing the me-level designation of the operators. Safety documentation, the 3rd fragment, recording the consequence profile for unauthorized activation. Transfer record, the 5th fragment, documenting the custodial arrangement for one machine. Location record, the 6th fragment, preserving the current location of a stored machine. The 2nd fragment is the altered tablet, partial, damaged by institutional alteration. Its document type, before alteration, was likely a combined status and functional description record for the 2nd machine. The alteration removed the functional description, leaving the status and location information. 6 document types, covering the institutional file requirements for a managed system of significant objects. The collection is institutionally complete, or as complete as it can be given that some documents may not have survived. What remains is not a random assortment of mythological texts. It is a coherent institutional file. Institutional files do not arise by accident. They arise because someone maintained them, kept them organized, ensured they were preserved in the archive, understood their institutional purpose, and acted to protect it. The machine archive was maintained. Someone cared about its coherence and its preservation. That person, or those people, understood the machines as real objects requiring real institutional management and took the institutional action required to ensure the management documentation was complete and preserved. The mythological reading cannot account for this institutional care. Mythological texts are preserved because they are sacred, because they carry religious meaning, because their recitation has liturgical function. They are not preserved because someone needs to manage the objects they describe. The machine archive is not a liturgical collection. It is a management file. The difference is in the purpose, not of the documents individually, but of the collection as a whole. Read the collection as a management file. The administrative argument follows from the formal features of the documents. The formal features are determinable from the documents themselves. The documents are in museum collections. The analysis is available to anyone who approaches the collection with the correct interpretive framework. The interpretive framework is the choice. The formal features do not change with the choice. The grammar does not change. The vocabulary does not change. The structure does not change. The documents say what they say, in the genre they were produced in, using the conventions they follow. Reading them correctly means reading them in their genre, with their conventions, according to their formal features. Their formal features say administrative records. Their grammar says present continuous. Their content says location of a real object in underground storage. Now, back to the tablets. The fourth fragment introduces a concept that is easy to underestimate and impossible to understand without first understanding what the Sumerian Me tradition actually describes. Most introductions to the Me translate the word as divine decrees or divine gifts, the sacred attributes bestowed by the gods on humanity, the collection of civilizational blessings that made organized life possible. This translation is not wrong exactly, but it captures the least important aspect of the Me and misses the most important one. The Me are not decorative divine gifts. They are operational conditions. They are the requirements without which organized existence cannot function, not the trappings of civilization, but the prerequisites for civilization to be possible at all. To understand why this matters for the fourth fragment and for the machine archive as a whole, you need to understand the Sumerian conception of what holds the world together. The Sumerians did not conceive of the organized world as self-sustaining. The world as they experienced it, the world of cities and irrigation systems and temple complexes and scribal schools and agricultural cycles and astronomical regularities, was not something that maintained itself automatically. It was maintained. It was actively sustained against a tendency toward dissolution, toward the undifferentiated state that existed before the world was organized. The organized world required ongoing organizational effort to remain organized. The Me were the description of what that effort consisted of, the operational conditions that had to be continuously maintained for organized existence to be organized existence rather than its alternative. Kingship as a Me is not the declaration that kings are important or that political authority is divinely sanctioned. Kingship as a Me is the statement that political authority is a condition of organized existence, that without something performing the function of political organization, the organized world degrades. The scribal arts as a Me is not the declaration that writing is a divine gift to humanity. It is the statement that the capacity for systematic record-keeping is a condition of the kind of organized complexity that the world requires, that without something performing the scribal function, the organized world cannot maintain the institutional memory and administrative coordination it depends on. Music as a Me is the example that most clearly demonstrates what the concept means when you understand it correctly. Music as a Me is not the statement that the Sumerians enjoyed music, or that music was divinely inspired. It is the statement that rhythm, harmony, and ordered sound are conditions of organized existence, that the patterns of music reflect and reinforce the patterns of order that make organized existence possible, and that their absence would register as a degradation of the world's organizational condition. Music is not optional decoration, it is a maintenance function. With this understanding of the Me, return to the fourth fragment and its designation of the machine operators. The word used in the fourth fragment for the machine operators appears in a Me list, one of the surviving tablets that enumerate the Me, in the context of a specific kind of function, continuous maintenance of a boundary condition. Not a function that is performed once and then persists on its own, a function that must be continuously performed, because the condition it maintains would fail if the performance were interrupted. This is a critically important distinction within the Me tradition. Some Me establish conditions Kingship established as a me creates the organizational principle of political authority, and that principle is part of the structure of the organized world. Other me describe functions that must be actively and continuously maintained. The machine operator's designation falls into this second category. Their function, whatever it is that the machines they operate contribute to the maintenance of the organized world, is not self-sustaining. It must be continuously performed. The machines must be continuously operated. The operators must continuously hold their designation and exercise their function. What is the function? The fourth fragment describes it using a word that appears at the foundational moment of the Sumerian creation accounts, the moment when the original undifferentiated state was separated into distinct categories of existence, when what was formless became formed, when the organized world was first organized. The word describes the act of fundamental separation, the creation of distinct categories from a prior, undifferentiated state. The fourth machine, and by implication, the machine system as a whole, maintains the ongoing condition of that fundamental separation, not the original act of separation, which was performed once at the founding of the organized world. The ongoing condition of separateness, the continued distinctness of the categories that were established by the founding act. Without the maintenance function that the machines perform, the categories would begin to lose their distinctness. The organized world would begin to return toward the undifferentiated state from which it was organized. This is the Sumerian cosmological description of entropy, expressed in the vocabulary of the me tradition. The organized world tends toward disorder, toward the undifferentiated state, without ongoing maintenance. The me are the maintenance. The machines are among the instruments of the maintenance. The me-level designation of the machine operators is therefore not a religious honor or a ritual status. It is a functional assignment at the level of the most fundamental operations that keep the world organized. The operators are designated because the function must be performed, and the function must be continuously performed, and someone must be designated to perform it. The designation is not personal. It does not attach to specific individuals because those individuals have demonstrated worthiness. It attaches to a category of functional role, the way kingship attaches to a functional role rather than to a specific person's personal merits. This understanding of the me-level designation has direct implications for how the machine archive should be read and how the sixth fragment's location information should be approached. First implication: the machines are not optional. They are not luxury items or impressive achievements or sacred objects of religious veneration. They are maintenance equipment for the foundational conditions of organized existence. Their operation is as necessary as the operation of kingship and the scribal arts. If the machines are not functioning, something about the organized world's organizational condition is failing. Second implication: the operator's designation is not religious qualification, but functional assignment. The operators are not chosen because they are holy or pious or spiritually advanced. They are designated because the function must be performed and a category of persons must be assigned to perform it. This means the machines are operated by functionaries, not by saints, and functionaries operate within institutional frameworks, not within spiritual ones. Third implication: the institutional framework that manages the machines is not a religious institution in the sense of a system of belief and worship. It is a functional institution in the sense of a system of operational management. The temple administration that managed the machines was managing a maintenance system for the organized world's foundational conditions, an operational responsibility as much as a religious one. Fourth implication: the underground placement of one of the machines, documented in the sixth fragment, is not an act of ritual burial or religious concealment. It is an institutional storage decision made within a functional management system. The machine was placed underground because institutional reasons, whatever they were, called for underground storage. The location was recorded because institutional logic requires that stored objects of this importance have their locations documented. The retrieval document was preserved because the function the machine performs is too important for the storage location to be unknown. This last implication is the one most directly relevant to the investigation this series is conducting. The me-level importance of the machines explains the care with which their documentation was maintained. A machine as important as kingship does not get casually buried without a location record. A machine as important as the scribal arts does not get lost in underground storage without a retrieval document in the archive. The care of the documentation reflects the importance of what is being documented. The sixth fragment exists. The retrieval document was written and preserved because the machine it describes is too important not to have a retrieval document. The importance is established by the me-level designation. The me-level designation explains the documentation. The documentation preserves the location. The location is in the sixth fragment. Understanding the me tradition is therefore not a digression from the question of where the machine is. It is an essential part of understanding why the location was recorded and why the record was preserved. The location was recorded because the machine is too important not to have a location record. The record was preserved because the function is too fundamental to be without retrieval documentation. Now, consider what this means for the question of whether the function has ceased. The me-level designation of the machine operators is not a historical designation that expired when the Sumerian civilization ended. The me, in the Sumerian understanding, are not features of Sumerian civilization specifically. They are features of organized existence as such. They describe conditions that any organized world requires. The dissolution of the Sumerian institutional infrastructure that managed the me-level functions does not dissolve the functions themselves. It dissolves the management system. The functions remain. The operational conditions remain. The maintenance requirements remain. What does not remain in the current world is an institutional system for performing the maintenance. The Sumerian temple administration managed the machines as a me-level maintenance function of the organized world. The temple administration is gone. The management function has no institutional home in the current world. The machines are presumably still in their locations. The sixth fragment's present continuous tense recording a condition that has not been administratively changed. But whether they are being operated, whether the maintenance function is being performed, whether the conditions they maintain are being maintained, is not something the surviving archive can answer. This is not a question this series can answer either. The series does not make claims about the cosmological consequences of the machine's non-operation. The cosmological framework within which the Sumerians understood the machines is their framework, and this series does not adopt that framework as its own. What the series adopts is the administrative reading of the documents. The machines are real objects. The documents are real administrative records. The location is a real location, and the retrieval document exists and is readable. What the me-level designation adds to the investigation is the explanation of why the documentation is so careful and so thorough. The machine archive is not a casual collection of miscellaneous notes. It is a carefully maintained institutional file for objects of the highest functional importance. The care of the documentation reflects the importance of the documented system. The presence of a retrieval document, specifically, reflects the understanding that these machines are too important to be inaccessible. The machines were placed in underground storage. The location was documented. The documentation was archived. The archive was preserved in clay. The clay survived. The retrieval document is readable. The importance of what the document describes is established by the fourth fragment's me-level designation. Something as important as kingship is in underground storage in the alluvial ground of southern Mesopotamia, and the location is in a museum drawer. The investigation continues in episode 4 with the entity prior to the organized world, the party from whom one of the machines was received in a custodial transfer, an entity whose title in the fifth fragment places it outside the organizational structure of the world itself. Understanding this entity, or rather, understanding the Sumerian scribal tradition's attempt to document this entity, adds the final layer to the picture of what the machines are and where they came from before they arrived in Sumerian custody. Now, back to the tablets. The me tradition's implications for the machine archive extend further than the operator designation alone. They affect how the entire archive should be understood as an institutional artifact. What kind of institution maintained it, why, and for whom? The Sumerian temple administration was not a single institution with a single set of responsibilities. It was a layered system with different levels of authority, different categories of function, and different tiers of documentation. At the base level, the temple managed the economic assets of the divine household: land, labor, grain, livestock, manufactured goods. At a higher level, the temple managed the religious and ritual functions that maintained the god's presence and favor. At the highest level, the temple managed the me-level functions, the foundational operational conditions of organized existence. The machine archive belongs to this highest level. The me-level designation of the machine operators places the machines in the category of the most fundamental institutional responsibilities, not daily temple economics, not regular ritual, but the maintenance of the foundational conditions without which the organized world cannot function. This is the level of the Ekur at Nippur, where the divine council met to establish the organizational principles of the world. It is the level of the institutions and functions that Sumerian tradition described as preceding and grounding everything else. An archive at this level was not an ordinary temple storage record. It was the documentation of the world's most fundamental maintenance system. The people who maintained this archive were not ordinary temple scribes. They were the specialists in the highest level temple functions, the scribes who managed the documentation of the divine administrative system at its most foundational level. These scribes would have understood the significance of what they were documenting. The me-level functions are not documented casually. They are documented with the precision and care that reflects their importance. Every element of the documentation is exact. Every term is chosen deliberately. The grammatical forms reflect the actual character of what is being documented, not approximations, not metaphors, not symbolic representations. The documents say what they mean and mean what they say. When the sixth fragment uses the present continuous, the scribes who produced it chose that form because the content was current. They knew the difference. They were trained in the grammar, and they applied it with professional precision to content of the highest institutional importance. The present continuous, in the sixth fragment, is not a stylistic choice or a conventional formula. It is the correct grammatical form for the content being documented. Consider what the me-level importance implies about the archive's preservation trajectory. Documents of ordinary temple economic management, grain records, land allocation records, labor management tablets, survive in enormous numbers from Sumerian sites. They were produced in quantity, archived routinely, and replaced as needed. Their preservation is the preservation of routine administrative practice. Documents of the highest level me functions are rarer, more carefully maintained, more deliberately preserved. They are not produced in quantity because the functions they document are not performed in quantity. There is one seat of kingship. There is one institution of the scribal arts. There is one set of machines maintaining the foundational separation of organized categories. The documentation is singular because the function is singular. The singularity of the machine archive, 6 documents coherent as a file, preserved carefully enough to survive into the archaeological record, reflects the importance of what it documents. The archive was not a routine production that happened to survive. It was a deliberately maintained file for a non-routine function. Its preservation reflects intentional care, not accident. That intentional care is itself evidence of the machine's importance. The Sumerians preserved what mattered. The machine archive was preserved. What it documents mattered. Now, back to the tablets. The Me tradition also illuminates why the machine archive survived when so much else did not. The Me-level designations were not just operational categories, they were the categories that Sumerian institutional tradition considered most important to preserve in its records. The survival priority in the Sumerian archival system was weighted toward the most important institutional functions. Documents relating to Me-level operations were among the most carefully maintained. This archival priority is visible in the surviving record. The most complete sets of administrative documentation that survive from major Sumerian sites are those relating to the highest level institutional functions. The Me-level functions are documented in multiple genres across multiple sites, because multiple institutions considered them important enough to maintain records about. The machine archive's survival is consistent with this priority. Its Me-level character placed it in the highest preservation category. What is less usual about the machine archive's survival is that it survived as an institutional file, rather than as individual documents scattered across different collections. Institutional file coherence, the coherent set of document types covering all aspects of a managed system, is harder to maintain across millennia than individual documents. Individual documents are scattered by excavation, redistributed across collections, separated from their archival context. An institutional file that can be recognized as such after 4,000 years of separation and redistribution is rare. The 6 machine fragments are recognizable as an institutional file. This recognition is itself evidence that the fragments belong to a coherent original collection, that they were maintained together in the original archive, that they were understood as belonging to the same file, and that their coherence is a real feature of their original institutional context rather than an artifact of modern interpretation. Institutional file coherence is not invented by analysts. It is discovered by analysts who can recognize it when they see it. The recognition of the machine archive as an institutional file is the prerequisite for the entire investigative program this series has developed. You cannot conduct the companion document search without recognizing that the archive is a file and that the altered tablet is missing a component. You cannot apply the landmark identification methodology without recognizing that the 6th fragment is a retrieval document within the file. You cannot interpret the safety record as a safety record without recognizing that the 3rd fragment is a component of an institutional management file for a real physical system. The recognition follows from the administrative reading. The administrative reading follows from the formal analysis. The formal analysis is available from the documents themselves. The documents are in museum drawers. The analysis is available. The recognition is possible. The investigative program follows. Now, back to the tablets. The 5th fragment is the most unusual document in the machine archive, and not because of what it describes about the machine. The machine, the transfer of one of the 6 operational components into Sumerian institutional custody, is described in the standard vocabulary and structure of Sumerian custodial transfer documentation. The form is routine. What is not routine is who the machine is transferred from. The originating party in the 5th fragment is described with a title. Sumerian administrative practice used titles rather than personal names in official documentation because the title identified the functional authority of the party involved, which was the administratively relevant information. The title used for the originating party in the 5th fragment is composed of elements that individually appear throughout the Sumerian administrative and cosmological vocabulary, but the combination, the specific way these elements are arranged in this title, does not appear anywhere else in the surviving archive. The elements of the title, examined individually, a term for precedence or anteriority, for being before something in a temporal or ontological sense, a term from the me vocabulary, the vocabulary of operational conditions, of the functional requirements of organized existence, and a term for agency or productive action, for being the one who brings about or maintains something. Together, these elements combine into a title that describes an authority characterized by its temporal and ontological priority to the organizational conditions that the me describe. An authority that was before the me, before the organizational conditions of the world, before the framework that the me tradition describes and the divine administration maintains. This is not a title from within the divine administrative hierarchy. The divine administrative hierarchy exists within the organized world. Its highest members, the great gods, the divine council, the administrators of the cosmic functions, are the most powerful agents within the organizational framework, but they are within it. The 5th fragment's title for the originating party places that party outside it, before it, prior to the organizational conditions that the me describe and the gods maintain. The Sumerian creation literature provides a context for understanding what this might mean. Several creation narratives preserved in the Sumerian tradition describe a state that preceded the organized world, a primordial condition without the differentiation that makes organized existence possible. This pre-organizational state is described with language that is notably vague and sparse compared to the precise administrative vocabulary used for the organized world. The Sumerians were comfortable with administrative precision in describing the world they managed. When they described what preceded it, the language became careful and limited in ways that suggest the limits of their conceptual framework rather than limits of their scribal skill. But the fifth fragment's title for the originating party is not vague, it is specific. It uses the vocabulary of the me tradition, the precise administrative vocabulary of the organized world's maintenance system, to describe an entity that precedes the organized world. It applies the precision of the administrative tradition to a category that the cosmological literature typically leaves in the zone of vagueness. This is unusual. It implies that whoever wrote this title had a more specific understanding of the originating party than the cosmological literature typically expresses. The originating party is prior to the organized world. The organized world's machines, the operational components of its foundational maintenance system, include at least one that was given to the Sumerians by this prior authority. The giving was formal, institutional, documented, and conditional. The transaction is recorded in the standard form of a custodial transfer. The machine was received. The maintenance conditions were specified. The Sumerian administration accepted custodial responsibility, and the terms included a return clause. The return clause is described in language whose implications deserve full attention. In the standard custodial arrangement, the return clause specifies the conditions under which the managed object would be returned to the original party. For a temporary custody, goods held while a transaction is completed, land managed while the owner is absent, the return condition is typically the completion of the transaction or the return of the owner. For an indefinite custody, goods held in trust with no fixed end date, the return clause typically describes what would trigger the return: a request from the original party, a change in circumstances, a specific event. The fifth fragment's return clause is the indefinite custody type. The Sumerians held the machine in trust, with no fixed end date for the arrangement, subject to a return or relocation directive from the original party whenever that party required it. The Sumerian administration agreed to these terms. They accepted indefinite custody of a machine belonging to an entity prior to the organized world, on terms that could be ended at any point by that entity's directive, and they maintained the record of this agreement in their administrative archive. Why would the Sumerians agree to these terms? The Sumerian temple administration regularly managed goods and land belonging to divine authorities on exactly these terms, indefinitely, subject to the divine authorities' requirements, with no fixed end date. The temple's relationship to the god was indefinitely custodial by definition. The temple managed divine assets on behalf of the divine authority that owned them, and that arrangement continued as long as the temple existed and the divine authority's presence was acknowledged. The fifth fragment applies this same framework to the machine transfer. The entity that gave the machine is, in the Sumerian administrative understanding of the transaction, in the position of the divine authority, the owner, whose requirements the custodian is obligated to meet. The Sumerian administration is in the position of the temple, the custodian, whose responsibility is to maintain what it holds in the correct condition and to comply when the owner makes a requirement. The maintenance conditions specified in the transfer are described in language consistent with the fourth fragment's description of the machine's function: continuous operation, designated operators, the maintenance of a specific condition. The Sumerian administration was not simply storing the machine. They were maintaining it in operational condition. The custody was active, not passive. The machine was being kept functional, being operated by designated operators, being maintained as a working system, all while belonging, in the administrative sense, to the entity that had given it. Consider what it means that the prior entity retained ownership. In the Sumerian institutional system, ownership is the determinative legal status. The temple managed divine property, but the god owned it. The god's ownership was the legal foundation of the entire institutional arrangement. When the god owned land, the land allocation was the god's allocation. When the god owned grain, the distribution was the god's distribution. The administrative institution managed, the divine authority owned. This structure was not a formality, it was the legal reality. The prior entity's retained ownership of the machine has the same legal force. The machine, in the administrative sense, is not Sumerian property. It is the prior entity's property, held in Sumerian custody, managed under Sumerian institutional care, subject to recall at the prior entity's direction. The return clause is not a symbolic gesture. It is a legal instrument expressing a real legal relationship between real parties regarding a real object. This legal reality has practical implications. The Sumerian administration that signed the custodial agreement was bound by it. Their obligations, maintenance of the machine in operational condition, operation by designated operators, compliance with return or relocation directives, were real institutional obligations, not symbolic ones. The seriousness with which the machine archive was maintained, sealed records, information security measures, current state location documentation, reflects the seriousness with which the Sumerian administration understood these obligations. And the prior entity's return clause means that the underground storage documented in the sixth fragment might be the result of a relocation directive from the prior entity. The sixth fragment records the machine's current location as underground storage in the alluvial ground of southern Mesopotamia. The machine is not in the temple storehouse where operational machinery would typically be housed during active use. It is underground, in a storage condition that the scribe describes as intentional and functional. Someone decided to place it underground. Either the Sumerian custodians, exercising their management discretion in response to circumstances we do not know, or the prior entity, directing a relocation in exercise of the return clause. Either way, the placement was intentional. The location was documented, the documentation was archived, and the present continuous tense of the sixth fragment says the machine is still there. The prior entity from whom the machine was received is the most unusual element of the entire machine archive. An entity prior to the organized world, prior to the me, prior to the organizational conditions of existence itself, transferred one of the machines into Sumerian custody. This is not a Sumerian god. The Sumerian gods exist within the organized world. This is something older than the organizational structure within which the gods operate. The Sumerian scribes who documented this transfer did the best they could with the vocabulary available to them. They applied the administrative vocabulary of the me tradition to describe an entity that existed before the me. The result is a title that is grammatically and conceptually hybrid, applying the precision of the organized world's vocabulary to an entity that precedes the organized world. The title is the best approximation that Sumerian administrative language could produce for something that, by definition, is outside the framework that administrative language was designed to describe. What the prior entity is, beyond what the fifth fragment's title implies, whether it is a real entity of some kind that the Sumerians encountered or documented, or whether the title is a way of expressing a philosophical concept about the pre-organizational state, is a question this series does not answer. What this series documents is that the Sumerian administrative tradition recorded a custodial transfer from a party described with this title, in the standard format of a custodial transfer record, with legally binding terms including a return clause acknowledging the prior entity's continued ownership. The machine in the ground was received from an entity prior to the organized world. The prior entity still owns it, in the logic of the document record. The machine is in the location documented in the sixth fragment. The prior entity's return clause means that access to the machine, under the terms of the custodial arrangement, ultimately requires the prior entity's direction. None of this changes the investigative program this series describes. The machine is in the ground. Its location is documented. The investigation of that location is archaeologically and technologically feasible. Whether the prior entity would have anything to say about that investigation is beyond the scope of what the clay can tell us. The clay says, the machine is there. The prior entity's title says, there is an authority that preceded the organized world and that placed this machine in Sumerian custody. The return clause says, the machine is not permanently Sumerian. Beyond these things, the clay does not speak. Now, back to the tablets. The prior entity's title in the fifth fragment is not the only place where the machine archive gestures towards something older than the organized world. The first fragment's description of one machine's position, at the cosmological threshold between the organized earth and what lies beneath it, also implies a prior state. The threshold exists because the organized world has a boundary. The boundary exists because the organized world is not all there is. What is beneath it is older. The machine at the threshold maintains the distinction between the organized world and what it was organized from. This older stratum, the pre-organizational state that the organized world emerged from and that it must be continuously distinguished from, is also what the prior entity represents. The prior entity is not from outside the organized world in the sense of being from another place. It is from outside the organized world in the sense of being from before it, prior in time and prior in ontological order, existing before the organizational conditions that define the organized world came into effect. The Sumerian tradition has several ways of describing this prior state. The primordial waters, the Abzu and the cosmic ocean, represent the undifferentiated potential from which organized forms emerged. The great gods of the organized world, Enlil and Enki, and the other members of the Divine Council, are themselves products of this prior differentiation. They exist within the organizational framework. They did not create it from outside. They are among the organizational products. An entity prior to this organizational framework, prior to the framework that produced the great gods themselves, would be outside the organizational structure entirely. Not a god in the Sumerian sense, not a member of the Divine Council, something older, in a way that the Sumerian administrative tradition had no standard category for. The title in the fifth fragment is the scribe's best approximation within the available vocabulary. The scribe used the vocabulary of the Me tradition because it was the most precise available vocabulary for describing an entity characterized by its relationship to organizational conditions. Prior to the Me, existing before the organizational conditions that define the organized world came into effect. The title says this as precisely as the vocabulary allows. Now consider the implication for the machines themselves. If one of the machines was in the prior entity's possession before the organized world existed, before the Me came into effect, before the organizational framework was in place, then the machine predates the organized world. It existed before the world it now maintains. It was present when the differentiation that produced the organized world occurred. It was perhaps among the instruments of that differentiation. The fourth fragment's description of the machine's function, maintaining the ongoing condition of fundamental separation, is consistent with this implication. If the machines were instruments of the original differentiation that produced the organized world, their ongoing function is the maintenance of that differentiation. They keep doing what they did when the world was organized. The organized world continues because the machines continue. The machines are older than the world they maintain. This is what the fifth fragment's title for the prior entity implies, when read in context with the other five fragments. The machines are not Sumerian inventions. They are not human artifacts. They predate the organizational framework within which Sumerian civilization operated. They were in the prior entity's possession before the organized world existed. They were transferred to Sumerian custody for maintenance, with a return clause because the prior entity retains ownership of objects that predate the organized world and that the organized world has not changed the ownership status of. The prior entity's return clause is not unusual in the context of Sumerian custodial law. What is unusual is the prior entity's precedence. Everything in Sumerian law operates within the organizational framework of the organized world, within the framework that the Me tradition describes and the divine administrative system maintains. An entity prior to that framework is prior to the law. The law cannot govern the prior entity, because the prior entity predates the law. The Sumerian scribes who documented this transfer knew this. They applied the framework they had, the institutional framework of custodial transfer law, to a transaction that was technically prior to the framework. The result is legally coherent within the framework. The terms are clear, the parties are identified, the return clause is standard. But the prior entity's status is outside the framework within which the legal coherence operates. The document is legally coherent and ontologically unprecedented at the same time. 4,000 years ago, a Sumerian scribe pressed signs into clay, documenting a custodial transfer from an entity prior to the organized world. The clay preserved the document. The document preserved the terms. The terms include a return clause for an object currently in underground storage in the alluvial ground of southern Mesopotamia. Now, back to the tablets. The return clause in the fifth fragment has one more implication that bears directly on the current status of the machine in underground storage. The return clause establishes that the prior entity can direct the machine's relocation at any time. Relocation includes, but is not limited to, return. The machine could be moved to a different storage location rather than returned to the prior entity's direct possession. The sixth fragment records the machine in underground storage at a specific location. This location is the result of some decision. Someone directed the machine to that location. That someone is either the Sumerian custodians, acting on institutional judgment within the bounds of their custodial authority, or the prior entity, directing a relocation under the return clause. If the prior entity directed the relocation, then the underground storage location was chosen by the prior entity. The prior entity's reasons for choosing that specific location, that specific territory, that specific depth, that specific landmark, are not recorded in the sixth fragment. The sixth fragment records the outcome, where the machine is. Not the decision, why it was placed there, but the prior entity's choice of location would not be arbitrary. An entity characterized by its temporal and ontological priority to the organized world, an entity that exists before the me, before the organizational conditions of existence, would have reasons for choosing a specific storage location that are consistent with that entity's nature and purposes. The deep alluvial layers of the Great River System territory are the territory most closely associated with the Abzu, the primordial waters, the deep waters beneath the earth that represent the undifferentiated potential from which organized forms emerged. If the prior entity is connected to the Abzu tradition, if it is, in some sense, a representative or agent of the pre-organizational state, then storing one of the machines in the deep alluvial layers of the Great River System territory is a geographically and cosmologically meaningful choice. It returns the machine to a context close to the pre-organizational state that preceded the world the machine was designed to maintain. This is speculation. The fifth fragment does not say who chose the underground storage location. It establishes the return clause that would give the prior entity the authority to choose it. The sixth fragment records the outcome. The connection between the prior entity and the Abzu tradition is inferred from the title's implication of pre-organizational precedence, not stated in the text. But the speculation is consistent with the evidence, and it adds another layer to the investigation. If the machine's storage location was chosen by an entity with a specific relationship to the pre-organizational state, and if that entity chose a location in the deep alluvial layers of the Great River System territory for reasons connected to that relationship, then the location is not arbitrary. It is meaningful, and meaningful locations are, in principle, identifiable through the cross-referencing of textual description and physical landscape. The investigation continues to open. The prior entity's role in the location choice is an additional dimension of the investigative question. The geology, the archaeology, the administrative vocabulary, and the cosmological tradition all converge on the same region and the same type of location. That convergence is not proof, but it is not coincidence either. Now, back to the tablets. The third fragment is the piece of the machine archive that most directly demonstrates, without interpretation or inference, that the machines were understood as physical systems rather than symbolic objects. It is a safety record, and safety records are not written for symbols. Let us be precise about what a safety record is and why its existence in the machine archive is significant. A safety record is a document that describes what happens when a physical system is operated incorrectly or without authorization. It exists because the system can cause harm, and the people responsible for the system need to know what harm it can cause, under what conditions, with what spatial extent, in what sequence, and with what severity. The safety record is preventive documentation. It protects authorized users from the consequences of improper operation and establishes the operational parameters within which the system can be safely managed. Safety records are written for real physical systems. Boilers have safety records. Chemical processes have safety records. Nuclear facilities have safety records. Medical devices have safety records. The safety record is so closely associated with real physical systems that its very existence is evidence that the system it describes is real. You do not write a safety record for a myth. You do not specify the radius of effect for a symbol. You do not enumerate the staged biological consequences of unauthorized contact with a divine metaphor. The third fragment specifies a radius. It enumerates sequential environmental effects in 3 categories. It describes staged biological consequences beginning with perceptual disruption before progressing to physical condition changes. It does all of these things in the formal structure of Sumerian procedural consequence documentation. Begin with the radius, because it is the feature of the third fragment that most conclusively rules out the mythological reading. Radii do not appear in Sumerian divine punishment literature. When a god is angered and withdraws favor from a city, the consequences are civilizational in scale and divine in character. The crops fail. The city walls become vulnerable. Enemies advance. These consequences are not bounded by a measured circle around a central point. They are not described in terms of a distance within which effects occur and a distance beyond which effects do not occur. Divine punishment in the Sumerian tradition does not have a radius. It has a scope that is cosmological rather than geometric. The third fragment specifies a radius. The unit of measurement used is one that appears in Sumerian land measurement contexts, a unit that describes a meaningful but not enormous distance, not the scale of a city, not the scale of an agricultural district, the scale of the immediate vicinity of a structure, the area immediately surrounding the location of an activated machine. Within this area, specific effects occur. Beyond this area, the text implies, the effects do not occur or occur at diminished intensity. This is the spatial logic of a physical system, not the spatial logic of divine punishment. Physical systems that emit energy, fields, or substances have bounded zones of effect. The effects diminish with distance from the source. The boundary of significant effect can be specified as a radius from the source point. The third fragment specifies exactly this. Now the sequential environmental effects. The text describes 3 categories of effect within the radius: ground, water, and air. These 3 categories are listed in sequence. First, the ground changes, then the water changes, then the air changes. The sequencing is important. It is not a list of things that all happen simultaneously. It is a sequence of effects that occur in a specific order. Sequential effects in a physical system reflect the causal chain by which the system's action propagates through its environment. An effect on the ground precedes an effect on the water because the mechanism that produces the ground effect also, through the changes it produces in the ground, produces the water effect. The water effect precedes the air effect for similar reasons. The sequence is the fingerprint of the causal mechanism. Different physical mechanisms produce different effect sequences. The sequence in the third fragment describes a mechanism that acts first on the surface material, then on the water associated with that surface, then on the air above it. This is not how divine punishment is described. Divine punishment falls. It arrives. It is not described as propagating through a sequence of environmental effects beginning with surface material and working upward through the water to the air. The third fragment's sequential environmental effects describe a physical propagation process, not a divine act. The staged biological consequence is the most diagnostically significant feature of the third fragment. The text describes what happens to a person within the radius during an unauthorized activation in 2 stages. First stage, perception changes. Second stage, physical condition changes. The staging is explicit. The perceptual change is not simultaneous with the physical change. It precedes it. Perception before condition. First stage, then second stage. In the divine punishment literature of Sumerian religious tradition, consequences do not arrive in stages. Divine punishment falls complete. The storm arrives. The wall collapses. The enemies are there and then victorious. There is no intermediate stage in which the transgressor first experiences altered perception before the punishment arrives as a second stage. Divine punishment does not build through a biological sequence. It is the consequence. It does not announce itself through perceptual disruption before manifesting as physical effect. The staging of the third fragment's consequence reflects the logic of a physical process rather than divine action. In physical processes that affect biological systems, staged effects are common and predictable. The nervous system, which mediates perception, responds to certain kinds of environmental change before other body systems do, producing perceptual effects that precede, and in some cases predict, the physical effects that follow as the environmental change continues to act on the body. A scribe describing divine punishment would not know to include this biological staging, because divine punishment does not operate through a causal mechanism that produces differential timing in nervous system versus physical system response. But a scribe describing observed or documented effects of a physical environmental agent on a biological system would know to include it if the exposure produced exactly this staging. The third fragment was written by someone who knew about this staging, either through observation, witnessing, or having access to records of unauthorized activations and their effects on persons within the radius, or through the transfer documentation that came with the machines from the prior entity described in the fifth fragment. Either way, the knowledge is specific and physically grounded in a way that myth and symbol cannot produce. Near the end of the third fragment's consequence description, there is a phrase whose translation has been contested. Several scholarly readings treat it as a closing administrative formula, but one reading of the phrase interprets it as a duration notation, a statement about how long the environmental effects persist after the activation event ends. Not a closing formula, but a specification. The effects last for a defined period after the machine is no longer being operated. If this reading is correct, then the third fragment describes not just the effects of activation, but their persistence. The environmental changes to ground, water, and air do not cease when the machine stops. They continue for a period afterward. They outlast the activation event. They persist on a timer, and then the effects diminish. Persistent effects. Environmental changes that do not immediately reverse when the source of those changes is removed. This is, again, a physical description rather than a symbolic one. Symbolic divine punishment does not have a duration that outlasts the punishing act. Physical environmental contamination does persist beyond the initial event. The ground that has been subjected to whatever the machine did remains changed for a period. The water retains its altered quality for a period. The air holds whatever property it acquired for a period. A machine with a radius of effect, 3 categories of environmental change in sequence, a staged human response, and persistent but bounded environmental effects. This is the safety profile of a real physical system. Now consider what the third fragment implies about the origin of the safety documentation. The detail and specificity of the safety record suggests either that the Sumerian administration observed unauthorized activations and documented their effects, or that the safety documentation was provided at the time the machine was transferred into Sumerian custody. The second possibility is more consistent with the institutional logic of a custodial transfer. When you transfer a potentially dangerous physical system to a new custodian, you provide safety documentation along with the transfer. You tell the new custodian what to watch out for and what the consequences of mishandling are. If the safety documentation came from the prior entity with the machine, then the third fragment preserves knowledge that originated before the organized world. Knowledge about the physical consequences of misusing a system that predates Sumerian civilization and predates the organizational framework within which Sumerian civilization operated. The clay tablet in the museum drawer that holds the third fragment preserves this knowledge. The signs describe a radius, a sequence, a staging, and a persistence. These are the characteristics of a real physical system's effect profile. They were pressed into clay 4,000 years ago. They are still readable. The physical system the safety record describes is in the ground, near the landmark, at the depth, in the alluvial territory, and the safety record that describes what happens when it is used without authorization is in a museum collection, waiting for the same reader who reads the sixth fragment correctly, as a retrieval document rather than a mythological text. Now, back to the tablets. There is a further implication of the third fragment's safety record that has not yet been addressed directly. what the consequence profile tells us about the machine's operational mechanism. Consequence profiles, in modern safety documentation, are used to infer the mechanism of action of a hazardous system. If you know what a system does when it fails or is misused, what changes it produces in what sequence, in what physical categories, with what spatial extent, you can reason backward from the consequences to the mechanism. The sequence tells you about the causal chain. The categories tell you about what physical processes are involved. The spatial extent tells you about the energy or agent involved and how it propagates. The third fragment's consequence profile describes ground change, then water change, then air change, within a defined radius, with staged biological effects beginning in the nervous system before manifesting in the physical body, with persistent effects after activation ends. Reasoning backward from this profile, ground change before water change before air change, suggests a mechanism that acts on the physical substrate first and propagates upward through media in order of density, solid first, liquid second, gas third. This is consistent with a mechanism that originates in or acts first on solid material, producing changes that then propagate through the water-bearing layers and then into the atmosphere. Not an aerial mechanism, not a purely energetic mechanism that acts on all media simultaneously. A mechanism that proceeds from solid to liquid to gas in a causal sequence. The staged biological response, nervous system before physical body, is consistent with exposure to something that affects electrochemical processes, which is how the nervous system operates, before affecting physical tissue. The nervous system is highly sensitive to changes in electrochemical environment. Physical tissue changes more slowly in response to the same agents. A mechanism that produces electrochemical changes in the local environment would affect the nervous system first and the physical body subsequently. The staging is the expected profile of such a mechanism. The persistent effects after activation ends are consistent with a mechanism that produces lasting changes in the medium, changes that do not immediately reverse when the source of the changes is removed. Not a reversible energetic effect like light or sound, which ceases immediately when the source ceases. A lasting change in the substrate, in the ground, in the water, in the air, that persists on its own after the mechanism has stopped operating. Taken together, the consequence profile in the third fragment is consistent with a mechanism that originates in or is transmitted through solid material, acts on electrochemical processes before acting on physical tissue, produces lasting changes in physical media that persist after the mechanism stops. This does not identify the specific mechanism. There are multiple mechanisms consistent with this profile, but it narrows the space of possible mechanisms considerably, and it is the kind of analysis that the original recipients of this safety documentation, the Sumerian administrators responsible for managing the machines, would not have been able to perform with the conceptual tools available to them. They documented what they could observe or were told, the sequences, the categories, the extent, the duration. The mechanism behind the observations was not something they could characterize. The modern reader, applying modern physical analysis to the ancient safety documentation, can go further. Not to certainty, the profile is consistent with multiple mechanisms, and the machines themselves are not available for direct examination, but to a constrained understanding of what kind of mechanism the machines involve, based on what effects they produce when misused. This is the value of treating the third fragment as physical documentation rather than symbolic narrative. A symbolic reading asks, what does this consequence description mean in the context of Sumerian religious thought? A physical reading asks, what kind of mechanism produces a consequence profile of this specific character? The symbolic reading produces interpretations. The physical reading produces scientific hypotheses. The hypotheses are testable, in principle, if the machines can ever be located and examined. The safety record is not the end of the investigation. It is the beginning of a physical analysis. It tells you what to look for. It tells you what to expect. It tells you how the machines work, at the level of observable consequence, even though it does not tell you how they work at the level of mechanism. The machines are in the ground. The safety documentation is in a museum drawer. The physical analysis that connects the safety profile to a mechanism has not been conducted because the safety documentation has not been read as physical documentation. Read it correctly, as a real safety record for a real physical system, and the analysis begins. Now, back to the tablets. The safety record's existence raises one more question that this series has not yet addressed directly. Was there an incident? The safety record documents consequences for unauthorized activation. Safety records are written prospectively, before misuse, to prevent it, or retrospectively, after misuse, to document what happened and prevent recurrence. Which is the third fragment? The language of the third fragment is prospective in its grammatical form. It uses the conditional structure, if this, then these consequences. This is the grammar of a rule or warning, not of a historical account. Historical accounts use the past tense or narrative past. This happened, then this happened, then this. The third fragment's conditional structure is the grammar of a procedure or protocol, not a historical record. But the specific detail of the third fragment, the precise radius, the specific sequential environmental categories, the exact staging of the biological response, suggests knowledge that may have come from observation rather than purely theoretical analysis. The level of specificity is higher than what you would expect from a purely theoretical safety analysis of a system that has never been improperly activated. The detail suggests that someone had information about what actually happens, either because they had observed it or because someone else had observed it and provided the documentation. If the safety documentation came with the machine from the prior entity, then the observation may have been made in the prior context, before the machines were transferred to Sumerian custody. The prior entity would have had ample opportunity to observe unauthorized activations in whatever context the machines operated before they entered the organized world's management system. The documentation in the third fragment may be the record of observations made before the Sumerian period. If the safety documentation was produced by the Sumerian administrators based on observations made during their custodial period, then at least one unauthorized activation occurred during the Sumerian management of the machines. That activation produced observable consequences. Those consequences were documented. The documentation is the third fragment. Either origin produces the same document. The third fragment is what it is regardless of when and how the information in it was obtained. But the question of origin adds texture to the understanding of the machine's history. Were there incidents before the Sumerian period? Were there incidents during the Sumerian period? Is the underground storage of the machine documented in the sixth fragment the result of a decision to secure the machine more thoroughly after an incident demonstrated the risks of more accessible storage? The sixth fragment does not answer this question. The archive as we have it does not include an incident record that would settle the matter. The possibility that the underground storage was a response to a safety incident is consistent with the evidence, but not supported by it directly. What is supported directly is the existence of the safety documentation and the underground storage decision, in sequence. The sequence is consistent with a safety-motivated storage decision. It does not prove one. It is simply consistent with one. The investigation remains appropriately uncertain about this. The clay says what it says. What it does not say, the investigation does not claim to know. Now, back to the tablets. The second fragment is the piece of the machine archive that most directly demonstrates deliberate institutional decision-making about what information should be accessible and what information should not. It is a document that has been modified, not by time and damage, not by the ordinary physical deterioration that affects every ancient artifact, but by deliberate action, by hands, by decision, by someone who knew what they were removing and chose to remove it. The alteration is visible under the right light. Conservators who examine clay tablets use raking illumination, angled light that travels across the surface at a low angle, catching the raised and recessed areas of the clay in ways that reveal surface details invisible under flat overhead lighting. Under raking illumination, the surface of a clay tablet tells more than one story, the story the scribe pressed into it, and the story of everything that happened to that surface after the pressing was done. The second machine's fragment tells both stories. The scribe's story is present across most of the surface, administrative framing intact, location reference intact, physical description of the object intact. The story of what happened afterward is concentrated in one section, 3 groups of signs that are not there. Not missing because the clay is damaged, not missing because the surface has deteriorated, missing because someone removed them from fired clay with tools small enough to work at the scale of individual cuneiform characters, and precise enough to leave the surrounding text undisturbed. The removal happened after the tablet was fired. This is the critical technical fact. Before firing, correction was simple. Smooth the surface of the unbaked clay, press in the correct signs, continue. Removing signs from fired clay is different in every way. Fired clay has been transformed from a plastic, workable material into a ceramic that resists casual surface modification. To remove impressed signs from fired clay without destroying the surrounding material requires a tool, something with a pointed or edged working surface small enough to operate at the scale of cuneiform characters. Working at that scale, in hard ceramic, with sufficient control to leave the adjacent signs undamaged, requires deliberate effort, appropriate tools, and the patience to work slowly enough to achieve the result. The result on the second machine's fragment, 3 specific groups of signs gone. The clay where they were is roughened and slightly depressed in patterns consistent with tool removal. The surrounding text is pristine, not scratched, not nicked, not inadvertently damaged by whatever was used to remove the targeted signs. The removal was careful. The person who performed it took care not to damage what they were leaving behind. What they were leaving behind constitutes the majority of the fragment's content. The administrative framing survives completely. The location reference survives. The physical description of the object survives. Only the functional description was removed. Only the section of text that described what the object does. Consider that choice. You have access to a fired tablet in a scribal archive. You have the tools and skill needed to remove signs from fired clay. You are there, with intent to remove specific content. And you choose to remove the functional description while leaving the existence, the location, and the physical description intact. That is a deliberate information architecture, not concealment. Concealment would be destruction of the tablet, not correction. Correction would replace the removed signs with new ones, not ritual defacement. Ritual defacement in the ancient Near Eastern tradition targeted names, royal titles, divine images, not operational descriptions. What was done to this tablet targeted operational information specifically. The existence of the machine can be known. The location of the machine can be known. The physical character of the machine can be known. Its function cannot be known from this record. Function separated from location. This is an information security architecture. The full picture requires 2 documents. This one, which preserves the location and physical description, and a companion document that preserves the function. With only this document, you can find the machine, but not know what you are finding. With only the companion document, if it exists, if it survived, you know what the machine does but not where it is. The altered tablet is half of a divided secret. Who could have made this decision? In the Sumerian administrative system, the temple archive was maintained by the scribal administration under the oversight of the temple hierarchy. The archive was not casually accessible. Altering an archive tablet was an extraordinary action, outside the normal operations of the archive, requiring authorization that transcended the scribal hierarchy's day-to-day authority, the kind of authorization that resided with the highest levels of the temple administration. Or, and this is worth considering, with the prior entity whose custodial arrangement is documented in the 5th fragment. The prior entity transferred one machine into Sumerian custody under terms that acknowledge the entity's continued ownership and right to direct relocation. An entity with that kind of authority over the machine archive might also have had the authority, or at least the influence, to direct the removal of sensitive operational information from the archive. The alteration of the second machine's tablet could be connected to the custodial arrangement, the prior entity directing that the functional description of one component be removed from the accessible archive while the location information was preserved. This is speculation that the available evidence cannot confirm, but it is consistent with the evidence's direction. The alteration is an institutional act. It required institutional authority. The prior entity is the party with the deepest stake in controlling information about the machines, deeper than any Sumerian administrator, because the machines are ultimately the prior entity's property. Either way, the alteration was made. The information architecture it creates is real. The divided secret is real. The location half of the divided secret is in the sixth fragment. The function half is either in a companion document that may or may not have survived, or was destroyed. The decision reveals a sophisticated understanding of what kind of information is dangerous and what kind is not. The location is not dangerous without the function. Someone who knows where the machine is but does not know what it does cannot operate it. Someone who knows where the machine is but does not know where it is cannot find it. The division of the information between two documents, each insufficient without the other, is a security measure. The removal of the function from the location document completes the division. This level of institutional sophistication is not consistent with the mythological reading of the machine archive. You do not implement information security architectures for mythological objects. You do not divide location information from functional information across two documents, then surgically remove the functional information from the location document for objects that exist only as symbols. Information security measures exist because information has practical value, because knowing something enables doing something that has real consequences. The information security measure applied to the second machine's tablet presupposes that knowing the machine's function, combined with knowing its location, would enable doing something with the machine. The security measure was implemented to prevent that enabling. The machine's function is the dangerous knowledge. The location alone is not enough. You need both. This presupposition is only coherent if the machine is a real physical object whose function can be performed by someone who knows what it is. If the machine were a symbol, knowing its symbolic function would not enable anything physical. The security measure would have no point. The fact that the security measure was implemented carefully, precisely, by someone with institutional authority means the machine's function has real operational implications. Knowing it matters because using it matters. The alteration of the second machine's tablet is therefore not just evidence that someone wanted to control information. It is evidence that the machine is real and that its function can be performed. The companion document, the document that would complete the picture by providing the function that was removed from the location document, is either in a museum collection somewhere, not yet connected to this archive, or was destroyed in a more thorough removal of the functional information. If it exists and can be found, it would provide the complete picture, where the machine is and what it does. The location is in the sixth fragment. The function is in the companion document to the second machine's tablet, if that companion document survived. The systematic search for this companion document is one of the specific investigative leads this series identifies. Documents from the same original archive as the machine fragments are distributed across institutions in dozens of countries. The systematic identification of documents from the same institutional context, the same scribal hand, the same archival conventions, the same administrative framework, could in principle produce a companion document identification. The clay preserved the alteration as faithfully as it preserved everything that was not altered. The roughened surface where the signs were removed. The pristine surrounding text. The evidence of deliberate institutional action to control information about a real physical system. All of it is in the clay. All of it is readable. The information security architecture is visible in the surface of the tablet 4,000 years after the decision to implement it was made. Now, back to the tablets. The systematic search for the companion document to the second machine's altered tablet is one of the most important investigative actions that the correct reading of the machine archive would motivate. It deserves extended treatment here because the methodology of that search is itself evidence that the investigation is tractable. The search has a specific formal target, a Sumerian administrative document that shares the institutional context of the second machine's fragment. The same scribal conventions, the same administrative vocabulary framework, the same formal register, but which contains functional description rather than location and physical description. If the information security architecture of the altered tablet was implemented by separating the functional description from the location description, the functional description went somewhere. It is either in the companion document or it was the content of a document that was subsequently destroyed. Destruction is a possibility that cannot be ruled out. The information security measure applied to the second machine's tablet, removing the functional description from the location document, is the conservative version of the same security concern that could also motivate complete destruction of the functional description. The altered tablet tells us that the institution was concerned about the functional description being accessible. Removing it from the location document is a measure short of destroying it, but destroying it is a more complete security measure. If the functional description was destroyed, burned, dissolved, smashed to fragments too small to identify, then the companion document is gone and the functional description is lost. This is a possible outcome of the investigation. The information may be irrecoverably removed. But if the companion document was preserved, if it was removed from the accessible archive and placed in a restricted archive, or transferred to a different institutional location, or copied and the copy preserved in a separate collection, then it may exist in some museums' holdings, unconnected to the machine archive, because the connection has not been made. The methodology for searching for it involves systematic cross-referencing of existing museum collections for documents with specific formal features. The machine archive has a distinctive institutional context, a vocabulary cluster that combines me-level administrative language with the specific terminology of cosmological threshold management. This vocabulary cluster is not common in the broader Sumerian administrative corpus. A document sharing this vocabulary cluster, while also containing functional description language, description of what an operational object does rather than where it is or who manages it, would be a strong candidate for the companion document. The Custodial database contains over 340,000 catalogued cuneiform documents. Computational analysis of this database for the specific vocabulary cluster of the machine archive is technically feasible. It would not immediately identify the companion document with certainty. The vocabulary cluster might appear in other contexts for other reasons, but it would generate a list of candidate documents that could be examined more closely for content that is consistent with the companion document hypothesis. This kind of systematic computational search of existing museum collections has not been applied to the machine archive problem, because the problem, finding the companion document to an altered tablet that contains information security architecture for a real physical system, has not been formulated. The problem requires the administrative reading. The mythological reading produces no such problem. The companion document, in the mythological reading, would be another mythological text that tells you something about what the divine object symbolically does. Not a dangerous piece of operational information about a real physical system that someone deliberately separated from its location record. The administrative reading produces the problem, the methodology, and the investigative pathway. The problem is, where is the functional description? The methodology is systematic vocabulary search of existing collections. The investigative pathway is identify candidates, examine for content consistency, determine whether any candidate contains the removed functional description. The investigation is within reach. The database exists. The computational tools exist. The methodology is established. What is missing is the investigative will that comes from the correct reading. Read the altered tablet correctly, as an information security measure applied to a real physical system's functional documentation, and the companion document search becomes an obvious next step. Read it as mythological narrative, as a symbolic text with some damaged or missing content, and the companion document search is not even conceived. The roughened surface of the altered tablet is visible in raking light. The missing signs are physically absent. The information architecture is real. The companion document may be in a museum drawer alongside the main archive, or in a different institution's collection, unconnected by current scholarship to the machine archive. The clay holds the record of what was removed. The absence is preserved as clearly as the presence. The removed content went somewhere. The search for where it went is the logical next step of the investigation. Now, back to the tablets. The location of the machine described in the sixth fragment is not simply a set of spatial coordinates. It is a location within a specific geological context that has been changing for 4,000 years since the retrieval document was written. Understanding where the machine is requires understanding not just the location as the Sumerian scribe described it, but the geological transformation that has occurred at that location since the description was made. The geological context is the alluvial plain of southern Mesopotamia, one of the most distinctive and most extensively studied geological formations in the world. It is distinctive because it was made entirely by rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates, flowing from the mountains of Anatolia and the highlands of what is now Iran, carry enormous quantities of suspended sediment, fine particles of eroded rock, clay minerals, organic material, in their currents. As the rivers reach the lowland plain of southern Mesopotamia, they slow, their carrying capacity decreases, and they deposit the sediment they carry. Layer by layer, millennia by millennia, the deposited sediment has built up the flat, fertile, irrigable plain that was the foundation of Sumerian civilization. This process has been ongoing for tens of thousands of years. The alluvial deposits of the southern Mesopotamian plain extend to great depths, much deeper than any human construction has ever reached. The plain is, in geological terms, a deep accumulation of river-deposited material, not bedrock. And because the deposition has been continuous, the plain is layered, each layer representing a period of accumulation, the oldest layers at the greatest depth, the most recent layers at the surface. What this means for the sixth fragment's location information is specific and consequential. When the Sumerian scribe described the machine's location in terms of depth from the ancient surface was the surface of that era's most recent alluvial deposit layer. 4,000 years of subsequent deposition have added additional layers above the ancient surface. The machine, if it is still at the depth the scribe recorded, is now deeper below the current surface than it was below the ancient surface, deeper by the thickness of 4,000 years of additional alluvial accumulation. The question of how much additional accumulation has occurred is a geological question, and it is one that the geological study of the region has addressed in considerable detail. The rate of alluvial accumulation in southern Mesopotamia is not uniform. Different areas experience different rates depending on their proximity to active river channels, their position in the floodplain, and other hydrological factors. Areas immediately adjacent to river channels or in zones of frequent flooding accumulate sediment more rapidly than areas that are higher in the landscape or more distant from active channels. The variation can be significant. Rates differ by factors of several times between high accumulation and low accumulation zones. Despite this variation, general estimates of average accumulation rates for the region are available from the geological literature. These estimates are based on multiple lines of evidence: radiocarbon dating of buried organic materials at different depths, the known ages of archaeological sites and their depth below the current surface, palynological records at different stratigraphic levels, and direct measurement of accumulation in monitored areas over historical periods. The general estimates suggest that the surface of the southern Mesopotamian plain has risen by a meaningful amount since the Sumerian period, enough that the ancient surface is now at a depth below the current surface that is archaeologically significant. The depth the sixth fragment specifies, measured from the ancient surface, now corresponds to a depth from the current surface that is substantially greater than the fragment's measurement alone would suggest. This has two practical implications for any investigation based on the sixth fragment's depth specification. First, the machine is deeper than the fragment's measurement, expressed in ancient units, would suggest to a reader who did not account for the additional accumulation. The ancient measurement gives the depth from the ancient surface. To convert this to the current depth from the current surface, you add the estimated accumulation since the Sumerian period. The result is a greater depth than the ancient measurement alone implies. Second, the greater depth places the machine in the deep alluvial layers, the layers of pure river-deposited sediment that are below the zone of mixed cultural deposits. The zone of cultural deposits, the layers that contain archaeological artifacts, burned material, architectural debris, the accumulated physical record of human habitation, extends from the current surface down to the ancient surface and a bit below. Below the ancient surface, the deposits become progressively more purely alluvial, fine-grained silt and clay, without cultural inclusions. The machine, placed at a depth from the ancient surface that corresponds to the depth of major architectural foundations, is now in or near the boundary between the cultural deposit zone and the deep alluvial silt. This has implications for both preservation and detectability. Preservation. The deep alluvial layers are favorable for long-term preservation of non-organic materials. The fine-grained silt is chemically relatively stable. It maintains fairly constant temperature and humidity conditions. It is below the zone of biological activity that rapidly degrades organic materials and below the zone of agricultural and construction disturbance that affects shallower deposits. Materials in the deep alluvial layers can survive for very long periods without significant deterioration. The machine's storage in the deep alluvial layers was a preservation-favorable choice. Detectability. The deep alluvial layers are below the depth at which most conventional archaeological investigation operates. Standard archaeological excavation focuses on the cultural deposit zone, the layers that contain human artifacts and architectural remains. The deep alluvial layers are the geological matrix beneath the cultural deposits, not the primary target of most excavations. This means that conventional archaeological investigation of even well-excavated Sumerian sites would not have reached the depth at which the sixth fragment places the machine. The machine could be present at a known Sumerian site without having been encountered in any excavation conducted at that site. This is a significant finding. It means that the failure of previous archaeological investigation at Sumerian sites to encounter the machine described in the sixth fragment is not evidence that the machine is not there. The investigation has not gone deep enough. The machine's location, as specified in the sixth fragment, is in the deep alluvial layers, the zone that conventional archaeological investigation does not systematically investigate. The geological argument, therefore, both supports the plausibility of the machine's continued presence at its recorded location and explains why it has not been encountered in previous investigation. It is preserved by the deep alluvial conditions. It is undetected because the investigation has not reached its depth. Now consider the geological transformation of the landscape around the machine's location. The alluvial plain of southern Mesopotamia has not simply accumulated sediment while remaining otherwise unchanged. The landscape has changed dramatically since the Sumerian period. Rivers have shifted course. The Euphrates in particular has migrated significantly, its channel moving over the centuries through a range of positions. Ancient irrigation canals that were major features of the Sumerian landscape are now dry channels or completely buried features. Ancient city sites that were prominent features of the landscape in the Sumerian period are now tells, low mounds that protrude only slightly above the surrounding plain, their original urban character invisible from the surface. The landmark described in the sixth fragment, the major institutional structure that the scribe used as the surface reference point for the underground location, was part of one of these ancient cities. The city is now a tell. The landmark is underground, buried under 4,000 years of accumulated material. The surface reference point that was the starting point for the Sumerian retrieval procedure is now a subsurface feature, detectable by remote sensing and excavation, but not visible from the surface. This is the fundamental challenge of using the sixth fragment as a retrieval document in the current geological context. The document was written for a landscape that no longer exists as it was. The surface references have become subsurface features. The reference frame has shifted underground. But the reference frame has not vanished. Archaeology has been recovering the positions of ancient Sumerian structures for more than a century and a half. The major city sites are known. The positions of major structures within those sites have been mapped from excavation evidence. The landmark's underground position is, in principle, knowable, not from the current surface directly, but from the combination of the sixth fragment's description and the archaeological record of which major structures existed at which sites and where within those sites they were located. The geological transformation of the landscape is therefore not an insurmountable obstacle to using the sixth fragment as a retrieval document. It is a complication that requires additional steps, converting ancient measurements to modern metric equivalents, accounting for accumulated sediment, identifying the now underground landmark from archaeological records, and computing the machine's position relative to the identified landmark at the estimated current depth. These are tractable problems. The geological knowledge, the archaeological record, and the measurement conversion methodology all exist. What does not exist is the application of these tools to the sixth fragment's location information with the intent of producing an actionable search zone. The geological context is not an obstacle to the investigation. It is the framework within which the investigation must be conducted. The alluvial ground of southern Iraq is one of the most extensively studied ancient landscapes on Earth, and also one of the most deeply unexplored. The known sites, the known structures, the known depths, all of this knowledge points toward the same conclusion. The deep alluvial layers are accessible to non-invasive remote sensing technology. The geological knowledge needed to account for accumulation is available. The archaeological knowledge needed to identify the landmark is documented. The machine is in the deep alluvial layers. The deep alluvial layers have never been systematically investigated at the Sumerian city sites. The investigation is feasible. The investigation has not been conducted. Now, back to the tablets. The geological argument for the machine's preservation and concealment has a specific implication that deserves direct statement. The deep alluvial layers of southern Mesopotamia are, from an archaeological perspective, the most favorable environment for long-term preservation of non-organic materials that exists in the region. This is not an accident of geography. The alluvial plain's preservation conditions are favorable precisely because of the characteristics that make it alluvial: the fine-grained, water-deposited sediment that accumulated over millennia. Fine-grained silt is chemically inert relative to most materials that Sumerian administrative systems would have managed. It does not accelerate oxidation of metals. It does not dissolve ceramics. It does not compress and distort solid objects. It insulates against temperature fluctuation. It excludes biological agents of decay once the organic content of the burial zone is exhausted. Objects placed in the deep alluvial layers before the fine sediment sealed them in would be in a stable preservation environment within decades of burial. Once the sediment has settled and compacted around the object, excluding air, water percolation, and biological agents, the stability of that environment increases with depth, because deeper layers are more isolated from surface processes and more insulated from environmental variability. The Sumerian administrators who chose the underground alluvial ground of southern Mesopotamia as the storage location for the machine described in the sixth fragment, whether they were Sumerian administrators acting on institutional judgment or the prior entity directing a relocation, chose a preservation-favorable location. Not necessarily because they understood the geological science, but because they understood from experience that objects placed deeply in the alluvial ground of the river plain endure. The Sumerians lived on alluvial ground. They built on it. They excavated it for foundations. They knew that materials placed deep in it persisted. They knew that the deeper the placement, the more stable the conditions. The machine's preservation in the deep alluvial layers is therefore not remarkable in the Sumerian administrative context. It is expected. You put objects of importance deeply in the ground because deeply placed objects endure. You record the location because you need to know where to find them if they are needed. You record it in the present continuous because the location is current and you intend to be able to use the record for retrieval. What is remarkable, what the geological knowledge of the past 2 centuries adds to the Sumerian administrative practice, is the quantification of the preservation conditions and the implications for what the deep alluvial layers now look like in terms of the relationship between the ancient placement depth and the current surface. The Sumerians knew the machine would be preserved. Modern geology can tell us that it is now deeper than when it was placed, and by approximately how much and what kinds of investigation technology can reach it. The geology and the administrative record complement each other. The administrative record tells you there is something to find, where it was placed, and at what depth from the ancient surface. The geology tells you what has happened to the landscape since the placement, how to convert the ancient measurement to a current depth, and what preservation conditions the object has experienced. Together, they produce an actionable investigative framework. The framework exists. The geological knowledge exists. The administrative record exists. The two bodies of knowledge have not been brought together in service of a specific investigative question, because the administrative record has not been read as a retrieval document that generates investigative questions. Read it correctly, and the geology is directly applicable to the investigation. Read it as myth, and the geology is irrelevant. You cannot use geological knowledge to investigate the location of a symbol. The alluvial ground of southern Mesopotamia preserved the machine for 4,000 years. The present continuous tense of the sixth fragment says it is still there. The geological knowledge says where, at what depth, and under what conditions. The investigation is ready to begin. Now, back to the tablets. The third reference system in the sixth fragment, the landmark, is both the most specific and the most challenging element of the location record. It is the most specific because a surface reference point, correctly identified, provides the starting position from which the underground location can be calculated. It is the most challenging because the landmark is no longer on the surface. Begin with what the sixth fragment says about the landmark, because precision about the description is the prerequisite for attempting an identification. The vocabulary used in the sixth fragment to describe the landmark is the vocabulary of major institutional structures in the Sumerian administrative tradition. This vocabulary appears in Sumerian administrative texts when scribes are identifying buildings of significant size and institutional importance. Buildings that would have been unmistakable features of the urban landscape, recognizable from a distance, usable as reference points by anyone navigating the city or its environs. The vocabulary rules out private residences, minor workshops, small storerooms, and incidental structures. It points toward the category of major public buildings, temple complexes, administrative palaces, large granary complexes, the kinds of structures that were both architecturally prominent and institutionally significant. Within this category, the connection between the machine's management and the temple administrative system suggests a temple complex as the most likely specific type. The machines were managed within the divine administrative system. Their operators were designated at the me level. Their custodial arrangement was maintained in a temple archive. The institutional context is consistently temple-associated. A major temple complex as the location reference for a machine managed within the temple system is the most coherent identification. Now, consider what the archaeological record of major Sumerian city sites can contribute to the identification. The principal Sumerian city sites that have been significantly excavated, Uruk, Nippur, Eridu, Lagash, Girsu, Kish, Shurupak, Umma, all have documented major institutional structures whose positions within the ancient city plan are known from excavation evidence. At each of these sites, the excavators have mapped the positions of major temples, ziggurat platforms, administrative complexes, and other significant structures relative to each other and relative to the overall plan of the city. These maps are not complete. No site has been exhaustively excavated, but they are detailed enough to provide a reference framework for identification purposes. The challenge is that the sixth fragment's landmark description, applied to this reference framework, does not uniquely identify a single structure at a single site. The vocabulary that describes the landmark could, in principle, apply to multiple major structures across multiple sites. Without additional distinguishing information, a specific name, a specific function, a specific association that would narrow the field, the identification cannot be made from the landmark description alone. This is where the companion document argument becomes directly relevant to the investigation. The sixth fragment is not the only document in the machine archive that might contain location information. The machine system described across the 6 fragments was managed with considerable institutional care, the kind of care that produces multiple complementary documents in a well-organized archive. The 6th fragment is the location record for one machine, but the complete institutional file for that machine presumably included other documents: maintenance records, operator designation records, inspection records, and, critically, additional location references that might have been more specific than the 6th fragment alone. If any of these companion documents have survived in existing museum collections, in unexcavated portions of the original archive's site, or in other archives that may have held copies of relevant documents, they might contain location information that is more specific than what the sixth fragment provides. A companion document that names the specific city, or that names the specific temple, or that provides an additional reference point would narrow the identification space significantly. The systematic search for companion documents is one of the most tractable aspects of the investigation. The Machine Archive's institutional context defines a searchable set of formal features. Documents from the same archive would share these features. The existing catalogues of major Sumerian tablet collections, the British Museum, the Oriental Institute, the Louvre, the Iraq Museum, the University of Pennsylvania Museum, the Yale Babylonian Collection, and dozens of other institutions contain hundreds of thousands of cuneiform documents. Cross-referencing these catalogues for documents that share the specific formal features of the Machine Archive is a tractable scholarly task, though a lengthy one. The digital cataloguing of cuneiform collections that has accelerated in recent decades has made this kind of cross-referencing significantly more feasible than it was a generation ago. Projects like the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative have created searchable databases of cuneiform documents that enable the kind of systematic formal comparison that the companion document search requires. The identification of the landmark is also approachable through working backward from the known archaeological record of major Sumerian temple complexes. The Machine Archive's institutional context provides several relevant constraints. The archive was maintained within the Sumerian temple administrative system. The machines were managed by designated operators at the me level. The custodial arrangement for at least one machine was with the temple administration. These constraints point toward major Sumerian temple centers as the institutional context. The principal candidates among the major excavated sites are Nippur, Ur, and Uruk. Nippur was the primary religious center of Sumer, the site of the Ekur temple, the primary temple of Enlil, the head of the Sumerian divine council. The temple archive at Nippur was among the most extensive in the ancient world. Major decisions about the divine administrative system, including the management of me-level functions, were associated with Nippur. If the Machine Archive was maintained at a primary Sumerian religious center, Nippur is the most likely candidate. Nippur's Ekur temple complex is documented from extensive excavation. The positions of the major structures within the Ekur precinct are known. If the sixth fragment's landmark is the Ekur or one of its associated structures, the landmark's subsurface position can be mapped with reasonable precision from the existing archaeological record. Was a major administrative and commercial center, as well as a significant religious site, the home of the Nana temple complex, and the site of the Great Ziggurat that remains the best preserved major Sumerian structure. The Ur-III period produced some of the most extensive administrative archives in the Sumerian tradition, and those archives were centered at Ur. If the Machine Archive was associated with the height of Sumerian administrative organization, Ur is a strong candidate. The Nana temple precinct at Ur has been extensively excavated. The position of the ziggurat, the Nana temple, and the associated administrative structures are mapped with considerable precision. If the sixth fragment's landmark is one of these structures, the landmark's subsurface position is known from the excavation record. Uruk is the oldest major Sumerian city and was the center of the earliest Sumerian administrative tradition, the site where cuneiform writing was developed and where the earliest large-scale administrative archives were created. If the machine system predated the Ur-III period and belonged to the earlier traditions of Sumerian institutional management, Uruk is the most historically appropriate candidate. Each of these sites has major temple complexes that have been excavated to varying degrees and whose positions within the ancient city plan are documented. The specific identification of the landmark requires comparing the sixth fragment's vocabulary against the known characteristics of major structures at each of these sites, and determining which site and which structure best matches the description. This identification work has not been systematically undertaken because the sixth fragment has not been read as a retrieval document whose landmark needs to be identified. Read as a mythological text, the landmark is a symbolic location that does not correspond to a physical structure. Read as a retrieval document, the landmark is a physical structure whose identity needs to be determined. The vocabulary of the sixth fragment's landmark description has specific features that should constrain the identification. A major institutional structure, likely temple-associated, connected to the Me tradition and the divine administrative system, located in the territory of the Great River System. These features, applied systematically to the archaeological record of the principal Sumerian city sites, should produce a ranked list of candidates in which some sites and some structures are more consistent with the full description than others. That ranking has not been produced because the investigation has not been conducted. The investigation has not been conducted because the reading that would motivate it, reading the sixth fragment as a retrieval document rather than a mythological text, has not been the operative reading. Change the reading, conduct the identification, compute the location, survey the site. The landmark is underground. The landmark is knowable. The machine's position relative to the landmark, at the estimated depth, is calculable. The investigation is tractable. What exists is the sixth fragment. What it describes is a landmark near which a machine of Me-level importance is stored at depth in the alluvial ground of southern Mesopotamia. What needs to happen is the identification of that landmark and the calculation of the machine's position. The pieces exist. The analysis has not been done. Now, back to the tablets. The landmark identification challenge is not only a scholarly problem, it is also, in a specific sense, a temporal problem. The landmark was chosen as a surface reference point because it was prominent and permanent enough that the person using the retrieval document could identify it from the surface, measure from it, and locate the underground object. That logic requires the landmark to be identifiable from the surface. In the Sumerian period, it was. The major temples of Nippur, Ur, and Uruk were among the most prominent structures in their respective cities, and were visible for considerable distances across the flat alluvial plain. A retrieval document that specified the machine's location relative to a major temple complex was usable by anyone who could see the temple from the outside of the city. Anyone approaching with the retrieval document could identify the reference point, orient from it, and proceed to the location. 4,000 years later, the reference point is underground. The usability of the retrieval document as a surface navigation aid has been suspended by geological time. The reference point still exists. It is just underground now, and underground landmarks require different location methods than surface landmarks. This transition from surface reference point to underground feature is precisely where the methodological gap lies in the current state of Mesopotamian archaeology. Sumerian city sites have been excavated, but not uniformly across their full extent, and not to the depths of the machine's storage location. The archaeological record of major structures within each site is extensive but incomplete. What exists is a set of position maps, maps of where major structures are known to have been within the ancient city plan, that can be used as a proxy for the surface landmark that is now underground. The position map for a candidate site is not as precise as the original landmark. Standing in front of the Ekur temple at Nippur 4,000 years ago and measuring from its north wall to a point 60 cubits to the northeast at a depth of 30 cubits is a specific and precise operation. Estimating where the north wall of the Ekur was, from the excavation evidence of its foundations, with an error margin of several meters, and then computing the machine's location within that error margin, is a less precise but still meaningful operation. The error margin is what determines the size of the search zone. If the landmark's subsurface position can be identified to within a few meters, which is achievable for well-excavated structures at major sites, then the search zone for the machine is a correspondingly small area. If the identification is less precise, the search zone is larger. The size of the search zone determines the scale of the non-invasive survey required. For the best documented candidate sites, Nippur's Ekur precinct, Ur's Nana temple precinct, the position identification is precise enough to define search zones that are manageable with modern remote sensing technology, not a search of all of southern Mesopotamia. A search of a specific area of tens of thousands of square meters around a well-documented underground reference point. GPR and ERT surveys of that area, targeted at the estimated depth of the machine, would either find an anomaly consistent with the machine's expected characteristics or fail to find one. A negative result, no anomaly, would be informative. It would suggest either that the machine is not at that site, the landmark identification was wrong, or that the machine's physical characteristics do not produce sufficient contrast with the surrounding sediment for the survey methods used, or that the machine has been removed or relocated since the sixth fragment was written. A negative result is not proof that the machine does not exist. It narrows the possibilities. A positive result, an anomaly at the estimated depth and location, would be the beginning of a more intensive investigation. Not proof that the anomaly is the machine, but evidence that something is there that warrants further examination. The search begins with the identification. The identification begins with a systematic comparison of the sixth fragment's landmark vocabulary against the documented characteristics of major structures at each candidate site. That comparison has not been conducted. The analysis is ready to begin. The landmark description is in the sixth fragment. The archaeological record of major Sumerian structures is in the published literature. The comparison requires a scholar with competence in both Sumerian administrative vocabulary and Mesopotamian archaeological evidence, not an unusual combination in the field, and the motivation to approach the sixth fragment as a retrieval document rather than a mythological text. The landmark is identifiable. The machine's location is calculable. The investigation is tractable. Now, back to the tablets. The machine described in the sixth fragment is at a depth that conventional archaeological excavation does not systematically investigate. It is beneath the cultural deposit zone, below the layers of accumulated human occupation debris that constitute the primary target of conventional archaeological work at ancient sites. It is in the deep alluvial layers, the fine-grained river-deposited sediment, that underlies the cultural deposits. This depth has been treated, implicitly, as making the sixth fragment's retrieval information practically useless. If the machine is below the zone of conventional archaeological investigation, how would you find it? But conventional excavation is not the only investigative technology available. The past several decades have seen the development and refinement of a suite of remote sensing and non-invasive investigation techniques that can detect subsurface features without excavating them. These techniques can identify anomalies in the subsurface, differences in density, conductivity, magnetic susceptibility, or electromagnetic reflection that correspond to buried structures or objects. They can do this at depths that were previously inaccessible to investigation without excavation. Begin with ground-penetrating radar, because it is the most versatile and most widely applied near-surface remote sensing technique in archaeological investigation. Ground-penetrating radar, or GPR, works by emitting pulses of electromagnetic energy into the ground and measuring the reflections that return when the energy encounters boundaries between materials with different electromagnetic properties. Differences in soil density, moisture content, mineral composition, and the presence of void spaces or solid objects all produce detectable reflections. The timing of the reflected pulses indicates the depth of the reflecting interface, and a map of reflection intensities at different depths can be constructed from a grid of measurements across a survey area. GPR has been used extensively in archaeological contexts and has demonstrated the ability to detect buried walls, floors, pits, graves, and objects at depths ranging from a few centimeters to several meters below the surface. The depth range of GPR depends primarily on the frequency of the radar pulses and the electromagnetic properties of the soil. High-frequency pulses provide better spatial resolution but penetrate less deeply. Low-frequency pulses penetrate more deeply but with lower spatial resolution. The fine-grained alluvial silt of the southern Mesopotamian plain presents a challenging but not impossible environment for GPR investigation. High clay content and moisture retention in alluvial sediments can increase electromagnetic attenuation, limiting effective penetration depth. However, in the dry conditions of southern Iraq, where the water table may be several meters below the surface in many areas, The upper alluvial sediments can be sufficiently dry to permit GPR penetration to useful depths. Studies of GPR performance in comparable geological environments suggest that penetration to depths of several meters is achievable, depending on local conditions. The depth at which the sixth fragment places the machine, translated to a current depth from the modern surface, accounting for 4,000 years of additional alluvial accumulation, is within the range of what GPR can potentially investigate, depending on local conditions. It may be at or near the limits of GPR capability in this environment. But near-limit investigation, particularly with the low-frequency systems capable of the deepest penetration, could produce detectable anomalies if the machine represents a sufficient contrast with the surrounding sediment. What would the machine look like to GPR? This depends on the machine's physical characteristics, its composition, its dimensions, its internal structure. If the machine is composed of materials with different electromagnetic properties from the surrounding sediment, metals, ceramics, dense stone, or other materials with high dielectric contrast, it would produce a detectable GPR reflection. If it is composed of materials with similar electromagnetic properties to the surrounding sediment, it might not be detectable by GPR alone. The uncertainty about the machine's composition is a limitation of GPR as the primary investigation tool. But GPR is not the only technology available. Magnetic susceptibility mapping measures the response of subsurface materials to an applied magnetic field. Materials with high magnetic susceptibility, including many iron-bearing materials, fired clay, and burned organic matter, produce strong responses distinguishable from the surrounding soil matrix. Magnetic susceptibility mapping has been used successfully to detect buried kilns, metalworking areas, hearths, and structures with significant iron-bearing mineral content at considerable depths. If the machine contains iron-bearing materials, whether metallic iron or iron-bearing minerals in its composition, magnetic susceptibility mapping could detect its presence at the estimated depth. The spatial resolution of magnetic susceptibility mapping is generally lower than GPR, but its depth range can be greater, particularly with specialized instrumentation. Electrical resistivity tomography is another technique with potential relevance. ERT measures the resistance to electrical current flow through the ground, which varies with soil composition, moisture content, and the presence of buried objects. Dense, solid objects, including metals, dense ceramics, and compacted deposits, typically have higher electrical resistivity than the surrounding soil matrix. ERT can detect these resistivity contrasts at depth and generate three-dimensional maps of subsurface resistivity variations that reveal the location of high resistivity anomalies. ERT has been used to detect buried walls, floors, and objects in archaeological contexts, and its effective depth range, in favorable conditions, extends to depths relevant to the sixth fragment's location specification. LiDAR, light detection and ranging, operates differently from the electromagnetic techniques described above. Rather than detecting subsurface features, LiDAR is used to map surface topography with extreme precision. A LiDAR survey of a landscape produces a detailed three-dimensional map of the surface, revealing subtle topographic features that are invisible to casual observation. For the sixth fragment investigation, LiDAR's most relevant application would be in the identification of the landmark. If the landmark, the major institutional structure that served as the surface reference point, produces a detectable surface expression at the site where it is buried, LiDAR mapping of the site could help identify the landmark's position within the overall site topography. Multispectral satellite analysis, using satellite imagery in multiple spectral bands, including infrared and radar, has also been used to identify archaeological features in the landscape of southern Mesopotamia. Ancient canals, city boundaries, and buried structures can sometimes be identified from satellite imagery through differences in soil color, vegetation density, and surface moisture that reflect underlying archaeological features. The combination of these techniques represents a powerful non-invasive investigative toolkit that could be applied to the sixth fragment's location information without requiring excavation of the kind that would disturb the cultural deposits of a major Sumerian site. The investigative program that these technologies would support has a specific structure. First, identify the candidate sites, the major Sumerian city sites that are consistent with the sixth fragment's institutional context and landmark description. Second, conduct LiDAR and multispectral surveys of the candidate sites to map surface topography and identify surface expressions of major subsurface structures. Third, compare the survey results with the known architectural record of each candidate site to identify which structures best match the sixth fragment's landmark vocabulary. Fourth, define a search zone around the identified landmark at the estimated depth of the machine, accounting for the uncertainty in both the depth calculation and the landmark identification. Fifth, conduct targeted subsurface surveys, GPR, ERT, magnetic susceptibility, across the search zone to identify anomalies that might correspond to the machine. This program is technically feasible with current technology. It is logistically complex. The candidate sites are in southern Iraq, and field investigation there requires navigating the practical constraints of working in the region. But the technology exists. The methodology is established. The logical structure of the investigation is clear. What does not exist is the investigative will, the commitment to treating the sixth fragment as a retrieval document whose location information is actionable, rather than as a mythological text whose content is symbolic. The technological challenge is not what stands between the museum drawer and the alluvial ground of southern Iraq. The interpretive framework is, read the sixth fragment correctly, as a retrieval document in the present continuous tense, with actionable location information, and the investigation is technically feasible. Read it as myth, as symbolic narrative without spatial referent, and the investigation is not even conceived. The tablets say it is there. The technology can look. The interpretation is the choice. The technologies described in this episode, GPR, ERT, magnetic susceptibility mapping, LiDAR, multispectral analysis, are not experimental. They are established tools used routinely in archaeological investigation around the world. They have been used in southern Iraq. They have produced results at depths relevant to the sixth fragment's location specification. The question is not whether the technology is adequate. The question is whether the interpretive framework that would motivate the investigation is adopted. The answer to that question is a reading question. Read the sixth fragment correctly, and the investigation is motivated. Read it as myth, and the investigation is irrelevant. The clay does not change with the reading. The ground does not change with the reading. The technology does not change with the reading. Only the investigative program changes. The investigative program is a consequence of interpretation. Read the tense the scribe chose. The scribe chose the present continuous. The present continuous says, is. The investigation follows from is. Now, back to the tablets. The integration of multiple remote sensing technologies in a coordinated survey program is not merely additive. Different technologies detect different physical properties. A machine that is invisible to GPR may be detectable by magnetic susceptibility mapping. A machine that produces no magnetic susceptibility anomaly may be detectable by ERT. A machine that is detectable by multiple methods provides convergent evidence from different physical measurements, a much stronger finding than a detection by a single method. The ideal survey protocol for the machine investigation would deploy multiple technologies simultaneously or in sequence across the same survey area. Each technology surveys the same spatial volume of the subsurface and reports any anomalies detected. Anomalies that appear in the results of only one technology are weak candidates. They may reflect the specific sensitivity of that technology to local conditions rather than the presence of the target object. Anomalies that appear in the results of two or more technologies are stronger candidates. They are detected by different physical processes and represent convergent evidence that something unusual is present. The multi-technology protocol also allows the results of one technology to guide the application of another. GPR survey results, which provide high spatial resolution at the limits of the depth range, can identify candidate zones for more targeted ERT investigation. Magnetic susceptibility surveys, which can detect iron-bearing materials at greater depths, can identify zones for subsequent GPR investigation with lower frequency systems capable of penetrating to the magnetic anomaly depth. This kind of iterative multi-technology survey protocol is standard in high-stakes, non-invasive investigation contexts. Oil and gas exploration uses exactly this protocol. Multiple geophysical methods applied in sequence to characterize subsurface structures before committing to expensive drilling. Archaeological investigation at major sites has adopted similar protocols when the importance of the subsurface target justifies the investment. The machine investigation is exactly the kind of high-stakes, non-invasive investigation that warrants this protocol. The investment in multi-technology survey is justified by the potential significance of what is being looked for. If the sixth fragment's retrieval document is accurate and the machine is at the described location, finding it would be among the most significant archaeological discoveries in history. The investigative investment is proportional to the potential significance. The logistical challenge of conducting such a survey in southern Iraq is real, but not insurmountable. Archaeological fieldwork in the region has continued, with interruptions, throughout the modern period. International teams have worked at major Sumerian sites in recent decades. The infrastructure for field investigation exists. The permission requirements for conducting geophysical surveys at major archaeological sites are well established. The security considerations for working in the region have been navigated by archaeological teams operating there. What the logistics require is a project with clear investigative goals, appropriate technical expertise, institutional support, and the necessary permissions. These are requirements that any major archaeological investigation must meet. They are not obstacles unique to the machine investigation. They are the normal requirements of field research. The sixth fragment specifies a location. Modern technology can investigate that location non-invasively. The investigation program is technically feasible. The logistical requirements are manageable. The investment is proportional to the significance of the potential finding. The barriers to the investigation are not technical or logistical. They are interpretive. The investigation is not conceived because the sixth fragment is not read as a retrieval document. Read it correctly, and the investigation follows. The technology is ready. The methodology is established. The location is specified. The clay says, is. The investigation says, go, now, back to the tablets. Not what scholars have said about the clay. Not what the mythological reading imposes on the clay. What the clay itself says, in the vocabulary the Sumerian scribes chose, in the grammatical forms they applied, in the document types they produced, in the formal conventions they were trained to apply with professional precision. Let us put it together, all of it, every fragment, every piece of evidence, every implication. The machine archive consists of 6 documents. They were produced by Sumerian scribes, trained in the administrative scribal tradition, working within the institutional framework of the Sumerian divine administrative system. They were preserved in an archive, in clay, which survives, and they have come down to us through the archaeological recovery of the last century and a half, distributed across museum collections in institutions around the world. Each of the 6 documents belongs, by its formal features, to the administrative genre, not the mythological genre, not the cosmological genre, the administrative genre, the genre of institutional management records, legal documents, procedural consequence records, and operational documentation. This genre identification is not imposed on the documents from outside. It is produced by the formal features of the documents themselves, their vocabulary, their structure, their grammatical conventions, their content organization. Administrative documents describe real things, real grain, real land, real labor, real objects under real institutional management. The 6 machine fragments, as administrative documents, describe real objects, 6 machines managed within the Sumerian divine administrative system. The 6 machines are 1. An object at the cosmological threshold between the organized earth and what lies beneath it, sealed. Still functional in its sealed condition. Location recorded for retrieval. The retrieval record preserved in the archive because the sealed condition is understood as temporary and the location information as needed for future access. 2. An object at the upper boundary of the organized sky. Multi-component assembly in a precise arrangement. Functional description surgically removed from the archival record after the tablet was fired. By deliberate institutional action, requiring institutional authority and institutional access, location and physical description preserved. The division of functional information from location information is an information security architecture. Knowing the location does not enable operating the machine without knowing the function. The security architecture presupposes that the machine is real and that operating it has real consequences. 3. A safety record for unauthorized activation of one of the machines. Physical, sequential, locally bounded consequences for ground, water, and air within a defined radius. Staged biological effects on persons within the radius. Perception before physical condition. Duration notation suggesting effects persist after activation ends. The safety record is written for a real physical system. Safety records are not written for symbols. 4. An operator designation record connecting the machine operators to the me tradition at the level of foundational importance, equivalent to kingship and the scribal arts. The me-level designation means the machines are not optional equipment. They are maintenance infrastructure for the foundational conditions of organized existence. The care with which the machine archive was maintained reflects the foundational importance of the machines. 5. A custodial transfer record. One of the machines was received by the Sumerian temple administration from an entity described with a title that places it prior to the organized world, prior to the me, prior to the organizational conditions of existence itself. The transfer is formal, institutional, and conditional. The machine is placed in Sumerian custody with specific maintenance conditions and a return clause acknowledging the prior entity's continued ownership and right to require return or relocation. This is not a mythological narrative, it is a legal document. 6. A current location record in the present continuous tense. Regional territory, the alluvial plain of southern Mesopotamia, the Great River System territory, what is now southern Iraq. Depth specification, equivalent to the depth of major Sumerian temple foundations, now deeper below the current surface by 4,000 years of additional alluvial accumulation. Landmark, a major institutional structure, most likely a temple complex, now underground at the site of an ancient Sumerian city. Storage condition, functional and intentional placement, the present continuous tense, not was, is. The scribe chose the grammatical form appropriate for current state documentation. The machine is located here, is. At the time of writing, the machine was in the described location, and the scribe used the form appropriate for current states rather than the form appropriate for historical events. The past tense translation convention has concealed this for the entire period since the document was first translated. The correct reading says, is. Now hold all 6 fragments together and read them as the institutional file they constitute. A system of 6 operational components is managed within the Sumerian divine administrative system. The system performs maintenance functions that the me tradition places at the level of foundational importance, corresponding to kingship and the scribal arts, functions without which the foundational conditions of organized existence cannot be maintained. The system was not built by the Sumerians. At least one component was received from an entity prior to the organized world in a formal custodial arrangement with legal terms. The system has documented safety protocols for unauthorized use, physical, sequential, locally bounded effects in a defined radius, staged biological consequences for persons within the radius. The functional information for at least one component was subjected to information security measures, surgical removal from the archival record by institutional action. At least one component is currently in underground storage in the alluvial ground of southern Mesopotamia, at a depth equivalent to major architectural foundations, near a landmark that is now underground at the site of an ancient Sumerian city. The institutional file is coherent. The documents within it are consistent. The management system they describe is internally logical. The formal features of every document point to the administrative genre. The content of every document is specific and concrete, rather than symbolic and vague. The care of the documentation reflects the foundational importance of what is being documented. This is not mythology. This is administration. And the administration preserved, in clay, the location of one of the system's components in underground storage, in the present continuous tense, for future retrieval. The retrieval has not occurred. 4,000 years have passed since the retrieval document was written. The Sumerian civilization that created the archive has dissolved. The institutional infrastructure that managed the machines has been gone for nearly as long. The prior entity's custodial arrangement has never been formally terminated in the surviving documents. No return record, no relocation confirmation beyond what the sixth fragment itself records, no administrative closing of the file. The machine, in the logic of the surviving documents, is where the sixth fragment says it is. The sixth fragment says it is in the alluvial ground of southern Mesopotamia, at depth, near a landmark that is now underground. The present continuous tense records this as a current condition, not a historical one. What would it take to investigate this claim? The investigation has a logical structure, established across the previous 9 episodes. Identify the candidate sites, the major Sumerian city sites, consistent with the machine archive's institutional context. Apply the landmark identification methodology. Compare the sixth fragment's vocabulary against the known major structures at each candidate site. Cross-reference the machine archive with other documents in existing museum collections to identify companion documents that might contain more specific location information. Apply remote sensing technology, LiDAR, GPR, ERT, magnetic susceptibility mapping, to survey the candidate sites and identify subsurface anomalies at the estimated depth of the machine. Use the results of the remote sensing survey to define a targeted search zone for more intensive investigation. This investigation is technically feasible. The technology exists. The methodology is established. The archival resources are accessible. The geological knowledge is available. The archaeological record of the candidate sites is documented. What is not available is the interpretive framework that would make the investigation seem worthwhile. The reading of the sixth fragment as a retrieval document rather than as a mythological text. Once that framework is adopted, once the sixth fragment is read as it was written, in the present continuous tense, as a current state location record for a real object in underground storage, the investigation follows naturally. The argument of this series, taken in full, is this. The 6 machine fragments are administrative records. Administrative records describe real things. The administrative records of the machine archive describe a real system of 6 objects managed within the Sumerian divine administrative system. The 6th fragment is the current location record for one of those objects, written in the present continuous tense as a retrieval document. The present continuous tense records the location as current at the time of writing. No subsequent document changes the location. The object is in the alluvial ground of southern Mesopotamia, at depth, near a now underground landmark in intentional functional storage. The argument is not certain. 4,000 years have passed. The archive is fragmentary. The return clause exists. The machine might have been returned or relocated after the 6th fragment was written, without a surviving record of the return. The uncertainty is real, but the uncertainty is bounded. The argument is not that the machine is certainly there. The argument is that the best available evidence, the 6th fragment, read correctly, in the context of the full machine archive, says it is there, and that no available evidence says otherwise. The case for investigation is not the case for certainty. It is the case for taking the evidence seriously enough to investigate. 4,000 years ago, a Sumerian scribe pressed signs into wet clay. The signs described a location. The clay hardened. The scribe's city was eventually abandoned. The city was buried under accumulating sediment. The archive the city housed was buried with it. Archaeologists excavated the site centuries later and recovered fragments of the archive. The fragments were catalogued, studied, and distributed across museum collections around the world. One of those fragments, in the present continuous tense, says that a machine of foundational importance to organized existence is in the alluvial ground of southern Mesopotamia, at the depth of major architectural foundations, near a landmark that is now itself underground. The clay says it is there. The clay is in a museum. The ground of southern Iraq holds whatever the clay describes. The investigation begins with reading the clay correctly. The clay has been waiting 4,000 years for a reader who reads it in the tense the scribe chose. Not was, is, now. Back to the tablets. End of series, the sixth fragment, a 10-part documentary series, total series runtime, approximately 10 hours, 6 machines, 1 location, 1 tense. There is one final thing to say about what the clay says, and it concerns the act of reading itself. The clay tablets of the Sumerian administrative tradition were not written to be literary. They were written to be functional. They were pressed with signs that conveyed specific institutional information to trained readers who could access that information when they needed it. The archive was not a library. It was a working memory system, an institutional record kept not for its own sake but for the sake of the institution's ongoing operation. When the institution dissolved, when the Sumerian cities were abandoned, when the temple administrations ended, when the scribal schools closed, the archive was buried. The tablets were pressed into the ground with the cities. For millennia, no trained reader had access to them. The institutional memory system was suspended. It was not destroyed. Clay survives. The signs were still there, still readable to anyone who could read them, waiting in the ground until archaeologists began to recover them in the 19th century. The recovery restored access to the institutional memory, not to the institution is gone, but to the records the institution kept. The records keep saying what they said when they were written. The grammar has not changed. The vocabulary has not changed. The formal conventions have not changed. The tablets say what the Sumerian scribes intended them to say. In the document types the scribes were trained to produce, according to the conventions the scribes were trained to apply. The sixth fragment says, "The machine is located here, present continuous, current state, retrieval documentation." That statement was intended for a reader in the Sumerian institutional context, a reader who could read the signs, recognize the document type, follow the reference systems to the location, and either retrieve the machine or report its location to whoever needed it. That reader never came. The institution dissolved before the retrieval was needed, or before anyone with the authority to retrieve could act on the record. 4,000 years later, a different reader looks at the same signs. Not a Sumerian temple administrator, not a trained Ejaba graduate, a modern scholar, trained in Cuneiform, trained in Sumerian grammar, trained in the administrative conventions of the Sumerian scribal tradition, a reader who can read the signs. What does this reader see? If the reader applies the mythological interpretive framework, the framework that categorizes documents produced within the Sumerian divine administrative system as religious texts to be read symbolically, the reader sees a mythological text about a divine object's ritual placement in a symbolic location. The present continuous becomes past tense. The retrieval document becomes a historical record. The location information becomes symbolic geography. If the reader applies the administrative interpretive framework, the framework that reads formal features to determine document type, that reads the present continuous as present continuous, that reads location information as location information, the reader sees a retrieval document for a real object in underground storage with 3 triangulating reference systems pointing to a specific location in the alluvial ground of southern Mesopotamia. The reader chooses the framework. The tablet does not change with the choice. The signs do not change. The grammar does not change. The formal features do not change. What changes is what the reader understands the document to be telling them. This series has made the case for the administrative reading. 10 episodes: the grammatical argument, the document type argument, the institutional coherence argument, the safety record argument, the information security argument, the geological argument, the landmark identification argument, the technology argument, the synthesis. The case is made, the choice is before the reader. Read the sixth fragment as it was written, in the present continuous, as a retrieval document, with real location information for a real object in underground storage, and the investigation begins. Read it as myth, and the investigation does not begin, and the machine sits where the sixth fragment says it is, in the alluvial ground of southern Mesopotamia, waiting for a reader who reads it correctly. The scribe who wrote the sixth fragment 4,000 years ago was writing for a reader who would use the document to retrieve the machine. That reader never came. The document waited, the clay held, the signs survived. The document is still waiting. The clay is in a museum. The ground holds what it holds. Not was, is. The investigation is yours to begin. Now, back to the tablets.